Let's move on to the Enforcement and Compounding Committee. Dr. Schad.
Oh, yes, okay. Okay, Enforcement and Compounding Committee, Chair Report. A discussion and consideration of possible board policy relating to the disclosure of enforcement actions involving board members. Background. On the Department of Consumer Affairs list of top 10 traits of an effective board member is be aware of conflicts of interest and clarifies such conflicts that could be either real or perceived. One area where board members should be transparent is in the area of enforcement actions, whether they're directly or indirectly involved. Board members should determine whether recusal should be based on real or possible appearance of self-interest. For example, an enforcement matter involving a board member could influence a member's objectivity in future decision-making. Committee discussion. The committee noted that to ensure greater transparency, the board should provide public reporting of any enforcement action affecting a board member. Examples of items that would trigger this reporting would be disciplinary or administrative actions. Such reporting could be completed as part of the board's Organizational Development Committee's report. The committee recommendation is a motion for that the board member involvement in disciplinary or administrative action will be reported in the organizational development report.
I have a few questions on this. First one is this something that other boards are doing, or are we singling our board out for this? Does anybody know?
You know the answer to that, Jenny?
I'm sorry, I was too busy chatting with people in the room. What was the question?
This is the DCA's list of the top 10 traits. Board members should determine whether.
I think we would be one of the few boards doing this. I don't think any other board has a policy in this area yet.
Okay, another question is, where do we go with this? I mean, let's say that let's say one of our board members is working for a chain store, and another employee of that chain store makes a prescription error. Does that mean that our board member has to recuse himself from every case regarding a prescription error going forward until that case is resolved?
I don't think this is meant to disclose actions of employees of a chain. I think what this is really referring to is if any one of us was involved in an enforcement action, as a public agency, a public board, and in the interest of transparency, we should openly disclose that. That's what that is. It's not about, because I know I recuse myself with Kaiser issues. I know Debbie does with CVS. This is if I personally have an enforcement action. This is what this is about.
Okay, so therefore, if I were, let's say, and of course this can't affect me here because I'm a CPA.
If you owned a pharmacy, it would.
If I did. But let's say I did own a pharmacy. And let's say that an employee of mine made an error. Would that affect me in my ability to, make decisions on cases here?
If you had an accusation filed against you personally.
Me personally, not against the pharmacy because of what an employee did.
I think in that respect, and Laura, correct me if I'm wrong, if we perceive a conflict, we are required to recuse ourselves from the voting of that decision.
I think in those particular circumstances, it would depend on the similarity of the actions.
Okay, but if my pharmacy,
I don't know that there would be a blanket prohibition.
If my pharmacy received a citation or something like that because of what this employee did, would that be one of these things that gets reported?
I think that's up to the board to decide about what's reported. I think the two issues are different. One, I think the policy, as I understood it, that the enforcement committee was recommending was simply reporting publicly to one another through its in the I think the discussion was to do it during org development. So the same way the statistics are disclosed in your packet about the number of meetings that you attend or something.
I think it's a
like
slippery
that.
slope because if we are going to decide which one gets reported and which one doesn't, I think there's going to be a lot of problem with that. I think it either has to be a set policy, that the situation that I mentioned doesn't get reported or it does get reported. But
Greg, I think
we,
if you read the committee discussion, I think it's the board should provide public reporting of any enforcement action that affects a board member. So it's one of us as a member, not the people
so
that
it's
we.
something that the member did, not something that happened in the pharmacy that the member may have owned.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, I
that's
think
fine.
the board
As
can
long as it's clear.
make that determination.
So, I just have a couple, I'm sorry, were you gonna say, did I butt on somebody? Okay, your mouth is full anyway, right? Okay. No, Ryan. Let's say we had a board member who,
How about a DUI?
A DUI, there you go.
Very possible.
well, I was thinking of something that actually maybe happened in a pharmacy. Then would we expect them, and then let's say we're making a reg, let's, something about a counting machine, and then we're making regs about counting machines. So then would we expect that board member to recuse themselves as we made the reg? I guess what I'm trying to understand, what would we do with this information? And part of it I understand is public disclosure. We should be, upfront and honest. But what are we going to do with that information?
That's
So I think it'd be the
another
same thing in terms of board reimbursement and travel expenses. Let's say that Debbie Veal had $6,000.
Or a citation. I mean, so
Yeah,
if I had a citation, you would list me on there, citation for crossing her I's and dotting her T's, and she wasn't supposed to do that. So that would be listed like one time, or?
I think one time when it happened is what I assume that this is what we discussed. And then after that, it just would be a way for us, because we are a public agency, and we should be very transparent in terms of what we do. And if we have an individual that is on this board that has an accusation, the board member should know about this.
So I would ask then if it was beyond the Board of Pharmacy, like, I don't mean to pick on you, Greg, but I'm going to.
Go ahead.
Like,
I could
let's
take-
say Greg has a whatever discipline against him and at the Board of Accountancy. Should that all, I mean, it seems like in fairness, and that should also
Yeah, I guess that
potentially.
would be, yeah. Now that I think of it, it would be. Yeah.
What's the
yeah.
beef?
I mean, that does-
I'm for transparency, I'm good with this, I just don't have a problem with.
Well, I think that's why I was trying to get at, what would we do with it? Would we ask them to recuse them if that
That's-
issue came
That
up?
was
Or
the
what would we
second
do
part of
with
my
it?
question. What do we do? Are we
Yeah.
going to recuse or?
If the case is on the board member, but not on the company. For example, if Amy is representing a Kaiser, so any Kaiser pharmacy have any problem, she will recuse herself, is not. So it should be on the board member
Individual
himself.
themselves.
Exactly, yeah, because I recuse myself.
And you're right,
Debbie
it
recuses
shouldn't just
herself.
be for licensees, it should be public members as well.
Yeah,
Or if they're licensed.
it should be transparency. I think this is just board transparency.
I'm sorry to interrupt. The recusal issue is a separate one, and that's required by other laws. So recusal or disqualification are required, and we've had training about that before, and it goes to, if it's a person that that's involved, then you recuse, or an employer, as just been discussed, those things are required. But as I understood it, the discussion was simply reporting, because any enforcement action that the board takes, or any board takes within DCA in California, is public. So actions taken are public.
So there are other boards doing this, it's not just us?
I'm reporting it out. I'm not aware of any others
You're not aware of any?
We'd be the only board doing this?
that I'm aware of. I haven't.
Can this maybe be
surveyed
kicked over to the
anyone.
DCA to look at, rather than us doing it as just the only board doing it?
Your light's not on.
If the board would like that, we'll be happy to just poll the other boards and see what they do, but I'm not aware that any.
recommend that because.
I'm still trying to.
Like I say, I'm saying this, Ryan, what's the problem? Why we fix anything that's not broken? What's being broken here?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm all for transparency, but I just want to make sure we understand the unintended consequences.
Right.
So this is my fear is, so I get listed on there, and then, does that make public or my other board members think of me differently? And perhaps
for that,
fairly
Jen.
and perhaps unfairly. So maybe I'm not a good.
So do you think, Debbie, that if there's an accusation filed against you in terms of your demeanor as a pharmacist, that should, and you're a member of this board, it shouldn't be transparent?
I haven't.
That's the question that I have.
You're also innocent until proven guilty, so if it's just an accusation.
No, I'm not saying accusations, I'm saying actual findings.
Yeah,
I agree with
once,
you.
yeah, once it's all done.
Once it's resolved and it's,
And the discipline is applied,
yes.
then you would do it.
So let's say that you went on, that you basically had an accusation, it was fine, you got a fine or you got a
And I have a
citation.
citation or I'm a probation or
So
whatever.
we don't review the citation, so nobody would
Okay.
see that, right?
Well, citations we sometimes see, but anyway, let's say I'm on probation, but,
But we would have put you on probation, probably, right? That would have been,
I think people on this board want to probate my mouth and say it can't open, but, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to percolate it. Like, I just want to make sure we're not setting
what
ourselves
if
up
you
for
got-
unintended
what if you got
consequences.
what if you got cited and fined? And you paid your fine? Should that be something that should be disclosed to the board, or should it just remain quiet?
It's
And you're a board
disclosed
member.
anyway in the profession. I mean, in the professional magazines and
But I
stuff,
could,
right?
someone just asked my question.
Oh, because it does on the
problem.
accountancy.
What are we trying to solve?
Yeah. What's the problem here?
Just the issue of transparency.
Yeah.
For what purpose?
So are we having problem here now?
Right, I don't see it.
I mean, I'm
It
okay
appears
with
in the
it.
script, right?
On the on your,
The cite and fines don't appear in the script.
They're public documents. The cite and fines are public documents, but we don't publish them on the website, nor do we
Right.
publish them in the script.
And the whole reason the committee had this discussion was about transparency of a sitting board member that has a cite and fine or something that nobody knows about and it just goes through.
so if you represent Kaiser, if the Kaiser being cited and fined, we will put you on the list?
Well, I said when you individually, so if I did it
Yeah.
myself, I should be on the list, yes.
Yeah.
If I had a cite and fine personally to myself.
Person, the person who gets cited for.
But I guess my question would be, if I'll ask it a different way, is, and I've been on this board, I don't know, 9, 10 years. It's never been an issue. Not that it won't present itself as an issue. But I'm not quite sure why we're spending time trying to develop a policy for an anomaly that could possibly happen in the future.
I second
It's
to that.
this thought. I mean,
Have a
and I'm
motion
not trying to
for
close
executive.
debate, but I'm just trying to get clarity on what our real purpose is.
Agreed.
Well, several members of the committee have had discussions with members of the profession about transparency, and I think that's where this originated. And so, as part of the steps, I'm going to ask something to be put on the agenda of the enforcement committee at the end of my report that has to do with transparency also. And this was just one more step towards that transparency. And so, the points you bring up weren't the points that we were discussing.
Okay.
So I mean, they're all valid. And so the
What about my points, Ellen?
They're not valid.
Points are valid too,
people are
Debbie.
just too sensitive, but I did turn this way purposely.
See, he's sitting next to me.
And so, while the committee indeed thinks it's a good idea, it sounds like the board has lots of questions here. Maybe this isn't the time to bring it forward, and we can defeat the motion, bring it back, or put it up for discussion again. I think Ryan's comment has some weight to it. Let's see, 3 people spoke, and these 2 have. And so, should we bring the committee made a motion? Should we bring it to a vote? And
What my suggestion is that we don't vote on this and we kick it back down to committee. And
Okay.
if you choose to bring it back, we're going to have that discussion.
well, in light of the
Can we do
the
that,
topics,
Laura?
can we do that?
Take it back to the committee and then bring it back?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's yours, but
To dig into it, to find out more about it and be able to answer those questions.
Right. We can bring back the information.
Well, at least clarify what we try to accomplish, what's the
Right.
problem?
Okay, and
And where you go from having that.
having that information and what weight it
What
has.
action will be taken as a result of
yeah.
that? That's a good point.
All right, let's do that.
All right, so there's a motion on the floor right now to refer this back to committee.
Second.
All in favor? Cool. Unanimous.
Goes back to committee.
Public comment on the vote that didn't really happen.
in case they need
We
to
have one.
reconsider.
Come on up,
If you
please.
come up and make public comment, then the board has the option to reconsider based on the public comment.
Yeah, okay.
Good morning.
Hi, I'm Rich Sakai, and I'm the former pharmacy director at Valley Children's Hospital, and have been a practicing pharmacist for over 40 years, hopefully making 50. I just wanted to let the board know, when I sign any sort of contracts or work at Valley Children's Hospital, I had to sign a non-disclosure statement for transparency and making decisions on which drugs that we would purchase, if I had any stock, whether it's individual or through mutual funds. And every position, every pharmacist, anybody in the leadership role signed this. And it was full disclosure, transparency. So there was no appearance of any conflict. I didn't make the decision to determine whether that was good or I could not vote or not. And I think we all took on a professional role to make that decision. We know what's right and what's wrong. One of my employees was brought up on an issue. I would support them, but yet it was human resources that made that decision. And I think I would totally agree, the full transparency. And is there a problem? Probably not. But why open up a situation when there is discussion or any accusation that there's bias on the board? So I think I agree with Alan that, it should be, taken up, and I'll defer to the board's decision. So thank you.
Can I make 2 quick points? One, as board members, we're required, we fill out a form called a Form 700. I believe it's twice a year. And that Form 700 discloses any types of conflicts of interest, our stock holdings and things of that nature, similar to what you do. I think we're all in agreement we need to find, or we may need to find, a better way of creating more sunshine. But before we vote on it, my recommendation is let's get it, right before we just go vote on something today. So
I agree.
Sorry.
I agree. But I think the
Thank you.
direction that Alan is going is the correct direction, in my opinion. Thank you.
Smart man, thank you very much.
I think one of the reasons we're postponing it, though, Rich, is to find what are we going to do with it once it's disclosed. I think that's the missing part that the committee didn't really look at.
So, because the public
A
comment,
motion of reconsideration based on public comment.
that's the question is whether or not the board would like to reconsider the motion based on
And
the
I would
public comment.
suggest that we do reconsider, since we did call for public comment before the vote, and then we can call the vote again.
Yes.
So motion to reconsider, all in favor? Aye, perfect. All right, then there's a call for the vote on the motion to send back to committee. All in favor?
Oh, wait, so do,
Do you want to repeat the motion?
well, only because now you have to do public comment again.
Thank you, Counselor. Any public comment? Hearing none. Now, may I call for the question, Counselor? Yes.
I am, second.
Yes. All in favor?
Great, thank you.
All right. Sorry. Go ahead.
To continue.
Alan B.
All righty. B, discussion and consideration of the FDA draft guidance for industry relating to grandfathering policy for packages of homogeneous cases of product without a product identifier. Background, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, signed into law November 2013, established the federal track and trace requirements. The requirements encompass the entire drug chain supply and are phased in over a period of 10 years. FDA previously released a guidance document delaying some of the provisions of this act. Specifically, the FDA indicated that it did not intend to take action against manufacturers who do not add a product identifier to each package in homogeneous case intended to be in commerce before November 27, 2018. Discussion. The committee discussed the draft guidance detailing the circumstances under which the FDA would exempt packages and cases of products to be sold that are not labeled with the required product identifier. Such products may be grandfathered if there is documentation that it was packaged by a manufacturer prior to November 27, 2018. As part of the discussion, the guidance document also highlights resulting downstream changes to remaining partners in the supply chain. Similar wholesaler requirements regarding the sale of products without the required product identifier will be delayed until November 27, 2019, and related dispenser requirements will be delayed until November 27, 2020. The committee was advised that the information on the delay in enforcement of these federal provisions by FDA will be included. We probably won't be testing on that. Okay.
I don't know. We're not giving that out yet.
Okay, C, CURS, I guess, as some people say here. Discussion and consideration of CURS 2.0 survey that California physicians and pharmacists experience with and attitudes about CURS 2.0. Background, in September 2013, California enacted a new law to update the Controlled Substance Utilization and Evaluation System. This law provided dedicated funding source for CURS. It also required CURS to streamline the registration process and mandated registration for dispensers and DEA licensed prescribers. As part of the upgrade, CURS personnel added the following new features: a streamlined electronic registration process, automatic alerts for certain high-risk prescription practices, ability to send peer-to-peer messages with CURS, ability to flag patient-provider agreements in CURS, and the ability for CURS users to identify delegates who can initiate bundle of upgrades authorized by Senate Bill 809, collectively referred to as CURS 2.0. As approved by the board at the 2016 July meeting, the board participated in assisting University of California, Davis in pharmacists. Questions were designed to learn about their use, access to, likes and dislikes, and concern with CURS. Also participated in a related survey at the same time. The survey also evaluated physicians and pharmacists' attitudes about prescription drug misuse and abuse, prescribing practices, and expectations about using prescription drug monitoring programs when prescribing or dispensing controlled substances. Discussed the recently published survey results. The survey was sent to a sample group comprised of a 1/24 of all California pharmacists, with 1,498 responded, and allopathic physicians, which I guess is non-homeopathic physicians, in 5,701, and 1/12 of all osteopaths in 577. The survey results suggest that CURS has a major impact on pharmacists' dispensing practices, that the increased professional awareness of risks and benefits plays a major role in decreased prescribing and dispensing for both physicians and pharmacists. These survey results indicate that the pharmacists have a near perfect compliance with mandatory cures registration. A copy of the survey and results is in attachment 2. Discussion and consideration of non-compliant California security prescription forms, which we addressed yesterday. Background: the California Health and Safety Code contains forms that are specialized prescription forms. Oh, they don't want to really hear me. Used for prescribing controlled substances in California. There are 14 security features that are required to appear on the form, and the California Department of Justice licenses the printers who are authorized to print these forms. Over the last year, the board has identified non-compliant security forms in use. When identified, the board typically cites and fines the pharmacy and advises the prescribing board that one of its practitioners is using non-compliant forms. Sometimes the board also identifies fraudulent security forms in use, the board also identifies fraudulent security forms in use, which are used to divert drugs or obtain them legally. These cases are also handled differently and more aggressively. The committee was advised that in early November 2017, 2 pharmacy chains stopped dispensing medications when a non-compliant security form was provided. In speaking with the Department of Justice at the end of November, the board learned that in October 2017, a Department of Justice audit of California licensed security printers identified 12 licensed printers that were producing security forms that were not compliant with the Health and Safety Code. As part of the discussion, the committee was advised that there are 33 DOJ licensed security printers at the time of the discussion. 4 licensed security printers continued to print non-compliant forms. The committee discussed 2 major areas of non-compliance: the no checkoff box for the number of refills and the absence of a watermark on the reverse of the form. When the program was initially established, the board was responsible for the approval of the security printers. However, in 2006, the responsibility was transferred to the DOJ. The committee considered if such licensure should return to the Board of Pharmacy due to our ability to increase. The committee considered if such licensure should return to the Board of Pharmacy due to our ability to license and regulate. The committee discussed a subscriber alert that was released by the executive officer to resolve the problem without harm to patients. A copy of the alert is included in attachment 3.
I have a question about this. Now, these are the prescription forms that the prescriber fills out, right?
Yes.
This is not something that's generated by the pharmacy.
No.
So what they're doing here is they're saying that we cite and fine the pharmacy for dispensing based on a form that was not proper, that was submitted to them, not something they created. Is that correct?
Right. One of the 14 security features was not on the form.
Okay.
At least one.
Okay. So it's not just the prescriber's responsibility to provide the proper form, it's also the pharmacy's responsibility to receive the proper form before dispensing.
Right.
Validate it. We become like the prescription
You're form
police.
police. You're the form police. And really, the pharmacist's time would be far better spent monitoring drug therapy and dealing with the patient instead of looking whether or not the form is prescribed.
Yep.
But on the other side of this, people are able to go online and get the forms without being appropriately licensed. And so, and in fact, in the packet's a $1.5 million diversion out of the system because fraudulent forms were obtained and secured and pharmacies weren't checking and they went out. So the pharmacy's kind of in a no-win. Plus, to make things even more dicey, you're in the middle of an opioid crisis where people are dying, where we've lost, 600,000 people since 2000. So there's something we've got to do here, and the difficulty is, it's part of the reason we're sponsoring the e-prescribing bill, is to get us to a position where this won't happen anymore. The forms are outdated, they don't work very well, they're not the deterrent they're supposed to be, and worse yet, they're harming patients and the whole healthcare system in terms of how they roll out. Now, that was a mouthful, sorry.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, it does seem a shame that we're the security
Yeah,
police. It's ludicrous.
Don't quite get it.
Yeah.
But part of the problem is there's certain prescribers, so form printers that are not legally supposed to be printing.
They were printing non-compliant forms. There may be some that are illegally printing forms as well, that I'm not aware of those, but again, that's also part of the problem, because the people that are doing the drug diversion out of the system aren't going to legitimate printers supposedly, although we understand that sometimes that happens too. But the goal is, the system that was set up to replace the triplicate back in 2003, that's how old this stuff is, has just totally blown up in today's world. And as a result, in part because of the deaths perhaps, we've now got in California, frankly, a mess with respect to how we prescribe drugs. And the case of Schedule II drugs, which you really can't do orally, there's a real problem. And so we're hampering patient care. We need to move on and get us all on the same page somewhere else, so that pharmacists can go back to drug therapy management and oversight, and the prescribers can go back and taking care of the diagnosing and treating of the patient, and get away from what form you're going to use to prescribe a drug.
Yeah, what's that?
The committee considered if licensure should return to the Board of Pharmacy. Is that an option available, or is that just a pipe dream?
Well, we would have to go back, statutorily pursue it. We'd have to get the bill enacted. We'd have to first ask whether DOJ wants to continue to do this. There's a bill in, as we discussed yesterday, and it was actually the Department of Justice that settled on 3 printers. So it wasn't just some arbitrary number. It's what the number was that the Department of Justice said it wanted to regulate to do printers, under the guise that in a short term, California will be transitioning, which it's doing without legislation, to e-prescribing.
Regarding, the chance of us going forward with ever doing these forms ourselves or dealing with the printers is remote, because it's
We're going to license a dinosaur. I think there's always going to be a need for paper forms, but the prevalence of those forms and their use to prescribe controlled substances, I see in the future, because electronically is where we're all going. Everybody's walking around with a cell phone. They'll be able to prescribe that way. It's where it's going to go. We're just not quite there yet.
So regarding the DOJ and their involvement with the prescription printers and with Cures itself, are we seeing fewer concerns from pharmacists as far as dealing with the Department of Justice, in particular with the Cures? I mean, this is an ancillary part of the Cures, but it seemed as though at the very beginning it was a bumpy start. Now it's Cures 2.0, so has there been less issue among providers with Cures 2.0 and the Department of Justice oversight?
Substantially less than when they first started to transition to 2.0, and when there was a requirement that everyone registered to access Cures. Because early on, they didn't have staff, and they didn't focus on whether or not the phone calls were handled appropriately, whereas for us, handling our phone calls is a major part of what we do. They didn't have the same philosophy, and it blew up. The end result was we were getting the calls that DOJ needed to handle and couldn't or wouldn't or whatever. So now pretty much the calls, the system is running better. They've got customer service people now that can kind of help resolve some of the problems when they come up. We're starting to get reports out. In fact, later this week, I have a meeting with DOJ where we're going to have them come to our next board meeting and provide a presentation on the auxiliary features of Cures, the peer-to-peer communication, and some of the other things that they've built in the system, so that pharmacists will be educated in that area too. They're spending some time working with the prescribers. We need the dispensers, who are the primary users of the group, to really get adept at using these supplemental features that weren't available in Cures 1.0.
Well, more to the point of what's going on right now, are patients being turned away from pharmacies?
Some are. And we've told them we expect them to validate the prescription with the prescriber and take care of the patient first. Identify the forms non-compliant, but take care of the patient.
And we're not citing and finding those.
No, we are not.
And
Alan, they are being turned away because they're not filling the forms. The patient's kind of filled in the middle right now.
I beg your pardon?
The patient's in the middle right now because they are being turned away.
And so,
So I just want to point out that there's another situation that happens here. It's not only that there's these licensed printers who are producing non-compliant forms, but there are some hospital systems that produce prescriptions that are to be used within the system, and occasionally they go outside the system. And quite often, those forms are non-compliant also. Once again, it's up to the pharmacy when they receive those forms or those prescriptions to, call the doctor and validate them. But there's like another wrinkle to why pharmacies are getting non-compliant forms. It's not just these printers that are non-compliant, but it's also systems, because within our law, it allows you to have a non-compliant form as long as it's being used within the system.
right.
Once it leaves the system, then it has to be compliant. And the doctors just don't always know, or the system's not set up to generate compliant forms because 99% of the prescriptions stay within the system.
So I can tell you that DOJ supposedly has corrected the problems with the non-compliant forms that are printed and did that, I believe, back in December. They had finished that. We do know that there are still some prescribers out there that are continuing to use their non-compliant forms because I guess they're expensive. So we don't have any leverage in that other than I'm working with the Department of Justice, but they need to solve that problem. But in the middle of an opioid crisis, we are sitting here with difficulty in validating a prescription form, which should really be a component, but not the sole component of whether or not a patient gets a drug. And it's like we've got the focus on the wrong thing right at the moment. But taking off the focus, and then it's a free-for-all in California. You can't have anything go in. So we're going to have to resolve this one day at a time, I suspect.
And Jenny, have you brought this to the attention of the medical board?
Yes, the medical board's fully aware, and they ran the comparable subscriber alert that we sent out. The one we sent out to our prescribers, to our dispensers, they sent out the comparable one to their prescribers back in December. We've been doing this since December. This is not a new issue, unfortunately.
Well, then the committee had a recommended motion that we direct the executive officer to work with the DOJ to ensure prescribers are receiving compliant forms. It sounds like, indeed, you're doing this. Is this motion necessary? Or does it give you additional emphasis that the board who you report to is particularly interested in resolving this problem if we do move should we make a motion or not?
I'm fully capable of doing it without it, but I think the motion is a posturing of the board stating that this is a policy crisis that you need to get some hands around. And by push, if I weren't doing this, I would say, I won't say that. I won't go quite that far. But this is one of the most critical things we have on our plate right now is making sure patients get a legitimately prescribed drug. And how we do that is going to be critical. And the problem is, the more we send out this information about the security forms, actually has the opposite effect that causes people to tighten up and refuse to use them. So we're working as hard as we can. We've got some individuals here, one of whom I was just speaking with, that is going to come up and talk a little bit about some of the frustrations that they're having with this and how it's impacting their ability to provide care. So I'm perfectly comfortable with you doing the motion because, again, it provides the motivation for me to keep out there. And as I say, I've already got a meeting scheduled later this week with DOJ to talk about this very issue and a couple of others, but this issue in particular.
Okay, so we should make the motion, then.
Yeah, you've got a motion.
All right.
He already made the motion, so I think we just probably want to do public comment and then we can.
Public comment? Well, Mark, good to see you.
How do we do it in Idaho?
No forms in Idaho required.
Do you e-prescribe? Is there an e-prescribing requirement in Idaho?
No e-prescribing requirement.
Either, okay.
So reading from the meeting materials that you've already read, 2 pharmacy chains stopped dispensing medications when a non-compliant security form was provided. I think we may be referring to CVS as one of those chains. There's no policy at CVS. So the question is, why are pharmacists refusing these scripts? And I think the answer is also in your meeting materials. The board has identified non-compliant security forms. The board typically cites and fines the pharmacy and actually the pharmacist. And so our pharmacists are running scared of this. So when they get a non-compliant form, they pick up the phone, they call the doctor. The validation is actually to tear that script up and start over with a verbal prescription, and then you have a valid prescription. In the case of a C3, 4, or 5, in the case of a C2, no answer. So realizing that, to me, there's 2 parts of this conversation. One is the security printers, and hopefully they're fixed, the watermarks, the refill boxes, all of that's required. But I think the second part, and the part that I get daily calls from customers, from administrators at hospitals, from our pharmacy teams, are what Debbie referred to, and those are the exceptions to 11162.1, the requirements of the prescription form. So specifically, the exemption in C1 says, a prescriber designated by a licensed healthcare facility, a clinic specified in Section 1200, or a clinic specified in subsection A of Section 1206, that is 25 or more physicians or surgeons, when treating patients in that facility, and I believe this is the key phrase, in that facility. And then as I go on, the exemption in C4.8 says, forms ordered pursuant to this subdivision that are printed by a computerized prescription generation system shall not be subject to paragraph A or paragraph 7 of subdivision A. Forms printed pursuant to the subdivision that are printed on computerized prescription generation system may contain the prescriber's name, category of professional licensure, license number, federal DEA number, and the date of the prescription. So one of the issues that we see are these prescriptions make it into the community, right? Somebody presents at the facility, they're treated in the emergency room, they are a patient in the facility, but the prescription makes it to the community to be filled. So I believe that the exception allows a community pharmacy to fill a hard copy that has a pre-printed date from one of these facilities. I don't believe, in what staff has interpreted in the past, that these forms are only valid within the facility. I think the patient has to be treated in the facility, and then the forms are valid anywhere. And so the exceptions are valid anywhere, so the date can be pre-printed. And then as we refer up to 7A, the second exemption are the quantity boxes. And those are the 2 items that I see 99% of the time. It's not watermarks and refill boxes and everything else. It's the hospital exemptions, and the scripts make it into the community. So one of the hospital administrators who rather loudly about forwarded me a letter that Janice Dang had written to all of the inspectors. I don't think this is a public document, but I'm going to read a little bit of it. To all inspectors, it has come to my attention, several inspectors are informing pharmacies that the institutional style controlled substance prescriptions that are computer printed must have the checkoff boxes, and the date of the prescription must be handwritten. This is not correct. When the prescription is generated by the computer for licensed healthcare facilities such as a hospital or for a clinic as specified in the reference number, the checkoff boxes are not required to be printed on the form, and the date written can be printed by the computer. Exactly how I think it reads. It's not exactly how the board is communicated to the public. Our pharmacists are refusing to fill these prescriptions. The patient is the one who's being harmed here. Requesting today that the board agrees with Janice Dang's interpretation, agrees with what she's told her inspectors in a non-public document, so that we can take care of the customers that.
Mark, what
present-
has Janice said to the what has she said in a non-public document?
What I just read.
Okay.
Yeah, and I called Janice and talked to her, and she fully backs her statement. The problem is, it's not a public document, and our pharmacists are running scared because they've been cited for this.
Well, and the problem is a little more than that, because the last section of this code section that includes everything we're talking about, this section shall become operative January 1, 2012. Prescriptions forms not in compliance with this division shall not be valid or accepted after July 1, 2012, which literally locks us in to having to, whatever this code section says, that's what we've got to enforce, or else you don't have a valid prescription. I don't know, I'm looking at my attorney. I figure you want to provide some.
Want me to?
Please.
The Janice Dang's opinion was supported by agency counsel, by myself. So in my view, the language treating could be read one of two ways. I choose to read it the same way that you do, which is as long as that person was treated in the facility, the prescription itself does not have to be filled in the facility. So an institutional prescription that's issued to a patient who saw, a hospital prescriber can take that prescription elsewhere, as is always the patient's right. And so that means that institutional prescriptions, which have these two exemptions that you've recognized, or these two differences, one not having the actual prescriber's name pre-printed, because they'll have just the sort of designated prescriber's name pre-printed, that those can still be taken outside. So yes, those prescriptions should be filled by community pharmacies that come across them, even though in some ways that language could be read to mean that prescription can only be filled within the closed system.
Which is, again, why we're encouraging, in the middle of an opioid crisis where we've got a concern about whether or not all the rigor of the security form is being enforced or is actually in place, that you validate the order again. We know it's a nuisance. We don't know how other way around it other than to say, well, whatever goes, goes. And that isn't going to solve the problem with the opioid crisis either.
But this really isn't about the opioid crisis. This is about getting patients from a hospital environment to get their medications. And that's the public good that we're concerned with here. It sounds to me what Josh has said is that we should go ahead and fill those without fear or running scared. So from my point of view, I think we should have this communicated somehow. I mean, there's no sense in punishing those patients that need medications. I mean, this I don't think is a big piece of the opioid crisis. Indeed, we're in the middle of one, but more people shouldn't become victims of it from not having their medication either. And so is it, any comments on this from the board? Laura looks like she's about ready to say something.
Josh, does this apply also to Schedule 2s?
Yes, this is the general requirements for all controlled substance prescription forms. This is
Generated by an institution that the patient.
Yes,
will
there's
take
no
it outside,
limitation. There's no limitation across schedules. It's for all forms 2 through 5.
that we could all fill these prescriptions outside the hospital.
Right, that's what my interpretation of this language of treating means, is that the institutional prescription requirements are that those prescriptions be issued to patients that were treated in that facility.
Okay.
Not that the prescription itself my opinion, if it had meant to limit it to only being, it would have said treated and filled, or something along those lines.
And I think this becomes really critical because, as we know from New York, they actually had the e-prescribing law, but the emergency department wasn't really successful with e-prescribing because a lot of times you don't know what pharmacy's open. So if you send a C2 to a pharmacy that's closed, the patient's impacted. So I know in New York, they actually moved more towards written prescriptions for emergency departments to provide patients with access to be able to get their medications. And if you can't, ED patients really need treatment.
I would just like to say one thing too, that this is not, we've heard Mr. Room's opinion. There is a divergent opinion by one of our other attorneys that disagrees with it. So again, it's clear, I think the board can make an interpretation of how we wish to proceed, and you may want to do that. But again, recognize that there's an argument made on both sides of this. Which opinion suits us? I think that's something you need to talk a little bit about, and what kind of difficulty the pharmacist is being put in. You know, it's bad either way. There's no easy answer. This is really a dilemma, as I say.
And I'd just like to point out that, you know, I completely understand the dilemma the pharmacists find themselves in, because this board repeatedly counsels the industry in general, you know, take care of your patients, exercise your professional judgment. So this is another instance in which we are asking them to exercise a professional judgment, but they are worried about the possible consequences to them for doing so.
So do we have inspectors presenting one view to the filling pharmacist and other inspectors with another view about?
I think initially, prior to November of 2017, that may have been a problem. That stopped in November. And we have a uniform policy. We sent out a subscriber alert. We ran it through the organization, and the letter, my guess is whatever you saw, would have been generated probably before the end of November. Because at that point, we had stabilized pretty much everybody by talking to a number of entities how we were going to do with this.
And what does the letter state that was given?
It was a subscriber alert that basically there's confusion about whether or not all forms are compliant. We want you to identify non-compliant forms, validate the non-compliant forms with the prescriber, and take care of the patient.
Was there any mention of the institutional forms that we're referencing here?
No.
Have there been citations issued because of
It also mentioned
institutional?
the subscriber alert,
Yes.
Amy, the subscriber alert also said something about you will be cited and fined.
You will not be cited and fined if you identify the form as non-compliant.
But Mark, have there been any citations as a result of this that you're aware of?
I am. Now, the few cases that I looked at, I didn't look at them all, involved numerous violations, and this was one
Going
of
way
the
back.
violations.
Yeah.
You don't know of any that just for this?
I didn't look at them all, but I didn't see any just for that. It was usually several things wrong with the form, including that.
So I can read the subscriber alert. So so California Health and Safety Code 1116.2 contains 14 elements that must, underlined, appear on the California Secure Forms, the forms used to prescribe controlled substances in California. These elements were first enacted in 2003 when the triplicate prescription form was discontinued. The law also requires that the California Security Form must be printed by California Department of Justice licensed printers. In 2006, the law was amended again to make several changes that took effect in January 2007. Finally, legislation enacted in 2011 required the California Security Form in use must be fully compliant with all requirements in the health and safety codes by July 1st, 2012. Here is a link to the required elements. In recent years, the board has continued to identify non-compliant California security forms in use that have been filled by California pharmacists. In violation of health and safety code requirements, the board's response upon identification of non-compliant form has been used a non-compliant form used to dispense controlled drugs is to educate the licensee and to cite and fine the pharmacy and pharmacists involved. Typically, the licensing boards for the prescriber is advised as well. Recently, some pharmacies have begun to refuse to fill prescriptions written on non-compliant forms where the items 1162.1A10 is not fully compliant with the required elements. One of these elements is checkbox, quote unquote, check boxes shall be printed on the form so that prescriber may indicate the number of refills ordered. There are also additional elements missing on some forms, including the lack of a watermark on the reverse of the form. The board recently has received complaints from patients or prescribers whose patients have denied medication from the pharmacy because of non-compliant forms. Interim solutions. Prescribers and dispensers need to become familiar with the 14 required elements on the security form. Prescribers with non-compliant forms should reorder compliant forms from the DOJ licensed security printer. Prescribers with non-compliant forms should consider using e-prescribing for controlled substances. Additionally, Schedule 3 through 5 controlled substances may be filled and refilled if the pharmacist treats the prescription as an oral prescription and verifies orally that the prescriber that the number of any refills ordered with the notation on the security form. California law prohibits that Schedule 2 drugs cannot generally be orally prescribed, nor can they be refilled using the California security prescription. However, when there is no alternative except to prescribe a Schedule 2 controlled drug using a non-compliant California form to allow the patients to receive their pain medication timely, prescribers and dispensers should communicate about why a non-compliant security form is being used on a temporary basis.
I have a question. So in all the years that I've been on the board, that Josh has been our representative from the Attorney General's office, I've relied totally on his opinion. And, well, maybe so, but I'm going to continue to go forward with that. And I've always felt that the board has felt the same way about Josh with his opinions. Why would the board go out and seek out another opinion? And in the event that that opinion differed than Josh's, why would we use that opinion as a basis of our policies rather than Josh's?
We have 2 liaison councils, and the other liaison council is on the opposite side of this issue, and she was available when Josh wasn't, when the issue blew up. And so keep in mind that this presented itself not in the terms of the institutional form. All of that was done at the time we thought it was a community issue only. And so the institutional piece has never had a subscriber alert sent out. But that's why we have 2 attorneys, and generally they agree. On this one, they did not. And I would not have sent out, it would have been totally irresponsible of me to send out that subscriber alert without the affirmation of one of our attorneys. And I work closely. No, but you need to know this wasn't cavalierly done. This is probably one of the most serious decisions this board's going to have to deal with in terms of how we move forward, because there's no brakes on this one. You've got ongoing care needs of patients and pharmacies to fulfill those needs, and we need to make sure that we're not cutting off the ability of those patients to get prescribed appropriately.
I agree with you totally.
So that's why.
My fear is that we're watching the pendulum swing in a direction which maybe is, some feel will have an impact on the opioid crisis, but many feel are going to have an impact on the treatment of patients in pain. I mean, and the VA organizations in particular are coming out very strongly about this opioid issue and the need for pain medications for patients. But it just seems to me we have battling opinions, and
But the board, we'd already kind of worked our way through this. We were not stopping the institutional forms. We're trying really hard to let those go because patients have been getting medication. That way we recognize that. What we're trying to do, though, on the other side of this is not totally take off anything to do with what kind of form gets processed in a pharmacy. No matter what, if you get a form, just fill it. We don't care, because we very much do. And one of the protections, and we're obligated by the Health and Safety Code to validate the prescription and make sure it's compliant. So we're trying to balance the 2 competing needs with patient safety in the middle of it. So take care of the patient, which is why we keep telling them that.
So Jenny, just a question on the institutional forms. Because I know that the DA does allow for institutional forms for unlicensed DA residents in training. So if I operate a hospital where I have residents in training, I can use an institutional form for my providers that are not licensed and fill them in my pharmacy.
But you're filling them in your pharmacy.
But,
So
what we're talking about here is institutional forms for providers that have their own DEA number. So they do have their licensed providers, have a DEA number, and they're using an institutional form. And are those the ones we're saying, or we're talking about
I
here?
believe those are the ones.
I just
we're
want to
saying.
clarify, because there is a difference with
it's
institutional forms.
The only thing that appears on the form, as I understand, is the chief physician for the hospital.
But they have a valid
They have to have
DEA.
at least 26 or 25, more than 20, I think it reads more than 25.
24, yeah, whatever.
And so I'm not quite sure at what point, how many names have to appear on it. I don't think we need to get down to that.
No, but if it has names on it, that means they all have DEA numbers. So we're not talking about the training institutional form.
No,
We're talking
no,
about
the other
ones for valid prescribers.
So my only concern is that fax blast I just read, and I think you kind of acknowledged it, it doesn't really address institutional
We
forms.
didn't know there was a problem. That showed up come December. That was my
Okay.
Christmas gift. But again, if we just put the patient, if it's patient-centered care, and we take care of the patient, it's gonna take a phone call, I'm sorry, I don't know how else to get around this without leaving everything out, but yet still making sure that the patient has access to the medication.
But the pharmacists, when they get this institutional form, they are going to have other ways of assessing the therapy. They're going to look at the patient, they can use their red flag approach, in terms of whether there's anything suspicious about it. So it's not, they're just not filling a prescription just off of a form. They're
I
actually,
don't know, the question came
they're
to me
looking
whether
at
we
using
do
their
that.
professional judgment as well. So if they're doing that, shouldn't we err on the caution of allowing patients the access? I mean, that's just,
Well, I think,
Mark?
Amy, what's happening is that they're
Yep.
saying, okay, are the 14 points
Yeah.
being met?
right. No, I understand.
Mark's got something here that may clarify things. I hope, Mark. I'm not.
Sure. I wanted to speak on why it's so important for the board to say that these are valid prescriptions, like according to Josh's interpretation. I mean, it's great that the board said they're going to stop fining, and of course we know you want to take care of patients, but calling and validating and not calling that prescription a valid prescription opens you up for a third-party audit. You're going to fill a prescription, take care of the patient, and not get paid. So that's why it's important for Josh's interpretation for the board to agree with, not just take care of the patient we're not going to cite.
Well, the audit, I don't think is the board's concern. The audit is patient access to medication, and the audit is a consequence that you face for misdoing it. But again, some of these forms are not compliant anyway, and I don't know how you validate in the community whether or not a prescriber whose name does not appear on that form is a prescriber. But again, we're not stopping that because we recognize that that may have been the interpretation out there for a while.
I would request that the board clarify in a newsletter or in another blast, or, I mean, it might be good enough for me to say, hey, I've got Janice Dang's unofficial letter, I've got a video where Josh says it's okay, but it would be.
Maybe you've got a video,
It would be much.
whatever that's worth, right, Josh?
It would be much better if there was an official communication in a board's position.
I'm reminded of when you're with a group of people and you're having dinner someplace, and so you pay the check in cash, and now you have the server taking your bills, holding them up to the light, and I don't know what they're looking for, but it's the same situation.
That's part of, I think, the ridiculousness of the security forms. It was intended to eliminate the triplicate, which was slow to obtain, you couldn't get them, and prescribers were always running out of them, and they never had them because you could only get them from DOJ in those days.
And
So the goal was to put in this tamper-proof system and have the security printers licensed and inspected, and the world would be a happy place. It didn't quite come out that way.
At the end of the road, the clerk takes the prescription and inputs into the computer. Does the pharmacist see that original prescription at the end of the road of filling?
Yeah, it depends on what software you have. These days, a lot of times it's scanned in and the pharmacist is looking at a scanned image and they never see the hard copy, but they can always go reference the hard copy.
Right, so that's my point, is, there are occasions when the pharmacist doesn't even see the original prescription, looking at a scan or looking at a label that they're filling off of the label.
But
The scan,
they
when
see
you scan,
the scanned image.
No, they got to look
see.
at the scanned image to check the typing.
In many states now, that's all you have to retain is a scanned image, the prescription shredded at the
Yeah.
end window. Many states, that's all you have to keep.
so Mark, when you copy one of the secure forms, you get like that void. When you scan it, is the void there or is the void not there?
old school scanners like a fax machine, the
They
voids
would
show
be
up.
there.
These are basically a picture. You're basically taking a picture of it. so
There's
the
no
doesn't
void.
show.
But keep in mind, there's thermochromic ink on it, there's a watermark that you have to hold up to the light. I think there's 3 features that you really need the original prescription to be able to access in order to determine its validity. So again, like I said, we've got this rather unusual set of requirements for the forms. My feeling is that we just figure out how we're going to handle the institutional forms. We'll do another subscriber alert, we'll publish it, and then we'll move on.
But so far, have we had any pharmacists got fined because of these violations right now? And that's a big issue, right? for
The
pharmacists?
institutional form, I don't believe so.
Okay.
I don't think we've been citing and fining for that.
I
We
think
did-
they're afraid of it. They're afraid to.
Well, I'm
Yeah,
sure, I mean,
yeah.
pharmacists would be afraid of it because
But the whole point is that we're not citing and fining, and that's part of what maybe that's the advantage of having this
that's one thing
discussion.
I think Mark was saying, we need to have this clarified and notify everybody so people will know, right?
Yes, please.
I think we have another public comment, Alan.
Art.
Thank you,
So
Mark.
I know that you
Thanks,
don't
Mark.
care as a board, but another unintended consequence, as Debbie brings up these prescriptions, we're long-term care. So all of our patients are in a skilled nursing facility. And we do err on the side of the patient constantly. In a recent PBM audit, they retracted $1,250 because they claimed that the prescription was not valid.
Well,
Thank you.
Afternoon, Keaton Patel with Kaiser Permanente, and just want to say thank you for this discussion. I think everyone here is trying to do the right thing. I believe the fax blast originally originated because the Department of Justice had a few printers that were not compliant, and there was a delay in getting those in order. That resulted in, Mark stated it perfectly, a little bit of paranoia on the parts of, pharmacies out in a retail setting and the independent setting. When you read something like that, you naturally become, a little bit more closed off. I believe the providers on both sides are trying to do the right thing, so we certainly support the discussion today. And Josh, thanks for that clarification.
Thank you.
Alan, what would you like?
No comment.
Oh, another public comment.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify also that CPHA has taken the subscriber alert and reiterated that to our members.
Thank you.
We are also working with other provider organizations to try and deal with the issue from our side of it as well. So I just wanted to make the board aware of that.
More public comment?
One more.
One more?
Good afternoon.
I just had another question about with the checkoff boxes for the
The microphone.
with the checkoff boxes for the refill piece, that's what some of our stores were getting dinged on because the controlled substances didn't have a checkoff box for the refills, even though like a C2 there is no refill.
the form is still required to have the checkoff box.
For the refills
Yeah.
as well as the quantity.
And if there's no
So-
refills,
Even if
The
there's.
form has to have all 14 features on it because at the time you're a prescriber, you don't know whether or not you're going to write a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. So the form is required, and again, it's that language down there in D that says the form shall not be accepted unless it's got all 14.
That's where the problem was with some of our stores that were getting rejections on that because of that.
thank you.
Okay, so we have got a motion on the floor, right? At this time? And as part of the discussion, we wanted to clarify the institutional paperwork, and we're going to do that?
We have a newsletter waiting in the wings on the outcome of this.
Okay, great.
So do you need a motion from the board on which direction to take?
I think we'd like clarity and then in the way forward and recognizing that we're going to balance this a little bit. And we'll use some enforcement discretion, but we want the pharmacies to still continue to identify they've got a problem with the form. even if they do fill it, if that makes sense.
What about the institutional forms?
The institutional forms, I think that we don't stop what the interpretation that's been made already, which is what you heard from both Mr. Room and from Dr. Dang, which is to allow them to use it outside and use their judgment about whether or not they have sufficient information at the time that they're evaluating the prescription as they normally would.
So are we going to maybe do a subscriber alert update?
We're going to do a newsletter and we'll do a subscriber alert, and that'll probably be shared widely. And we're just going to clarify the institutional form use
yeah.
as well. We'll probably run very similar to what's already there, but we'll add something with institutional forms, and I'll have Mr. Room write it.
So, I mean, I think the committee recommendation, we should maybe add in the institutional piece of it.
We'll add, yeah, that's.
I think we should have a
Do
separate
we
motion.
need a
on
separate
that.
motion for
Yeah, so we
that?
maybe,
Separate motion,
yeah.
okay.
Let's deal with the committee, the committee recommendation, do we need to do anything? Because you're already working with the prescribers for the compliant forms. So we probably need a motion on the institutional forms.
I mean, we can vote on it and just vote for it.
Vote on the
and
first
just
one, and then we'll
validate
just
it.
move
All
on.
right, let's vote, well, any more public comment before we vote on the first motion? Direct the executive officer to work with the Department of Justice to ensure the prescribers are receiving compliant forms. All in favor?
Thank you. Now, the
Okay,
new one.
second motion. Debbie, you want to make it?
Yeah, I would direct the executive officer and staff to, work with the correct parties.
All right,
Or with
correct parties.
correct parties, whether that be legal or whomever, to work on a communication plan both that includes the institutional forms via the subscriber
Filled
alert.
outside of the institution.
Yep, the institutional forms being filled outside the institution, both through a subscriber alert and a future article in the script.
Great.
Second?
Second.
Okay, public comment? All in favor? All right, Alan.
That was easy.
Oh.
All right.
Easy.
Yeah.
Depends on what chair you're sitting in.
Better, don't you think?
Update on emergency regulation to amend California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 1735.2, relating to compounding beyond use states. Let's see here. Okay, background. During its July 2017 board meeting, the board voted to pursue an emergency regulation to amend 1735.2 relating to establishing beyond use stating for non-sterile drug compounded preparations. The committee was advised that the emergency regulation took effect December 11, 2017, and will be effective for 180 days, during which time the regular rulemaking must be promulgated to make the changes permanent. 2 90-day readoptions of the emergency regulation are allowed if the board is making progress towards adopting permanent regulations. So essentially, that's a year. Update. Permanent regulations are currently in the DCA's pre-notice review period. Board staff are monitoring progress of the pre-notice review and working with the department to address concerns as they rise. Attachment 4 includes a copy of the emergency regulation language and the proposed amendment to the regulation language. Okay, number F. Discussion and consideration of draft frequency of draft FAQ relating to compounding requirements. Now, the next 8 items are changes to, requested changes to compounding regulations. I'm going to read them all, and then we'll have comments after the 8th one. If we don't do that, there'll be a lot of repetition, and so for clarity, I think it's best that we do it at the end. So, to begin with the FAQs, as part of the ongoing evaluation of the board's compounding requirements, some requested changes were proposed and are included in the board's emergency rulemaking to make the emergency rulemaking permanent as referenced above. During the meeting, when considering other requested changes, members determined that the change to the regulation was not necessary, but additional guidance documents would be provided. The committee reviewed the draft FAQs and invited the public to submit additional topics for FAQs. Attachment 5 includes draft FAQs in the following areas. Electronic monitoring of refrigerator and freezer temperatures, definition of sterility, definition of stability, identical as applied in CCR section 1735.2 I4, quality assurance minimum testing requirements. G, discussion and consideration of changes to the board compounding regulations, including presentation regarding beyond use testing. Relevant law, CCR section 1735, CCR 1751, establishing requirements for compounded regulations. Business and Professions Code, section 4127.1, requires the board adopt regulations to establish policies, guidelines, and procedures to implement Article 7.5, sterile drug products, and further requires the board to review any formal revisions to General Chapter 797 of the Pharmacopoeia and the National Formulary relating to compounding of sterile preparations no later than 90 days after the revision becomes official. Since the adoption of the board's current compounding regulations, the board has received public comment regarding the impact of the regulations on patient populations, principally for oral compounded preparations, including animals. The committee held its meetings on June 2 and July 11 to consider both written and verbal comments and requested changes offered by the board staff and members of the public. As noted in the prior agenda items, the board initiated emergency and regular rulemaking to update its regulations in response to some of the requested changes considered by the committee. During the September 2017 meeting, it was requested that the committee continue its consideration of the additional requested changes offered by stakeholders. During the meeting, Dynalabs provided the committee with a presentation on stability studies on potency over time. The presentation highlighted the differences between potency over time testing and stability indicating testing. The committee was advised that the USP calls for stability indicating testing. This is in attachment 6. Following the presentation, the committee considered possible changes to the board's current regulations. Below is a brief summary of the requested changes, relevant information considered by the committee, and action by the committee. The proposed change to CCR 1735B regarding the use of the compounding kits. The committee previously considered a change that would exempt from the definition of compounding the combination of non-hazard ingredients from prepackaged kits supplied by an FDA-registered manufacturer for non-sterile preparations. In response to public comment, the board staff was directed to contact the FDA to determine the level of regulatory oversight these kits have. Staff was subsequently advised the FDA is not aware of any FDA-approved applications for compounding kits and that the FDA has neither conducted a pre-market review of any instruction provided and with such products nor performed any pre-market review of the manufacturer's assignment of BUDs. The FDA also advised board staff that it is currently reviewing this policy in this area. The committee action is the committee stated a goal to move forward with change while making sure the kits are available and meet all standards. The committee directed staff to develop language for consideration of these texts. Proposed language to CCR 1735-1R.
Helen, can I make a comment? I have some people come up to me, make comment regarding the sterile compounding. They say that they complain that the different inspectors have different interpretation of those regulations. So I hope that they could have some kind of uniform interpretation so they all be consistent. So they could deal with the consistency, but they cannot deal with the inconsistency. So I hope the inspector will get together and have some kind of uniform guideline for them.
Well, this is a common theme with the consistency is one of the complaints that many people have, and so I agree with you. It's just like consistency with dealing with the prescriptions, and so let's discuss that a little bit more when we come to the end of these. But bring that up again because I think the consistency is important.
Main problem.
Okay. And I know we're going to have discussion on this one that I'm reading right now. Proposed change to CCR 1735.1R regarding the board's current definition of hazardous drug. The committee previously considered a request to change the board's definition of hazardous drug to mirror the definition provided in USP 800. Late September 2017, USP announced the postponement of the official date until December 1, 2019, to coincide with the anticipated update to Chapter 797. Consistency between the board's definition of hazardous and USP 800 should be beneficial to the board's regulated public. The committee action. The committee considered language that should be used to update the board's definition of hazardous to coincide with the effective date of USP 800. Until December 1, 2019, hazardous means all anti-neoplastic agents identified by NIOSH as meeting criteria for hazardous drugs and other drugs, compounds, or materials identified as hazardous by the pharmacist in charge. Effective December 1, 2019, hazardous means any drug identified by NIOSH that exhibits one of the following criteria: carcinogenicity, teratogenicity, reproductive toxicity, organ toxicity, genotoxicity, and hazarded mimetics. The committee requested the board staff research USP 800 requirements and the provisions for a risk-based approach. Number 4, proposed change to CCR 1735.2A regarding documentation of a prescriber's authorization to compound. During prior discussions, the committee considered if it would be appropriate to remove the requirement to document prescriber's authorization to compound a product and requested additional research to be conducted by board staff. Without documentation, neither the pharmacy nor the board will have any record that the prescriber authorized the use of the compounded product. Public comment previously contemplated that such requirement could result in a delay in therapy. Committee action. The committee directed staff to create language that is not burdensome or redundant to current requirements in law and focusing on consumer protection. 5. Proposed changes to CCR 1735.2I 2 through 4 regarding beyond use dates for sterile drug products. During prior discussions, the committee considered if changes were necessary to the requirements for the establishment of a beyond use date for sterile products. As at the time of discussion, the committee anticipated changes in the 797 would take place in 2018. Given the delay with the 797 changes, the committee considered changes to beyond use dating assignments that may more closely align with current 797 requirements. For sterile compounded drug preparations, the beyond use date shall not exceed any of the following: the shortest expiration date or beyond use date of any ingredient in the sterile compounded drug preparation, the chemical stability of any one ingredient in the preparation, the chemical stability of the combination of all ingredients in the preparation, the beyond use date assigned for sterility in section 1751.8, a beyond use date established by a pharmacist using his or her professional judgment after conducting research and analysis and preparing documentation. The pharmacist's documentation must demonstrate that beyond use date is supported by USP 671 compliant method suitability test. Beyond use date is supported by 1191 container closure integrity, and the beyond use date is supported by stability studies. And the drugs or compounded drug preparations tested and studied shall be identical in ingredients, specific essential compounding steps, quality reviews, and packaging as a finished drug or compounded drug preparation. Committee action. The committee asked board staff to research the impact of patients who need more than one dose and to look for alternatives. 6. Proposed changes to CCR 1735.6E regarding the venting requirements for hazardous drug compounding. The board's current regulations require hazardous compounding must be completely externally vented, physically separated from the room, and each PEC in the room shall be externally vented. Note, this is one of two provisions where the board has established authority for a pharmacy to secure temporary waiver to complete construction necessary to comply. Board staff received questions about venting requirements and was recently advised the board's application of the requirements, which allows single venting for both the PEC and the room, is consistent with OSHPD. Specifically, OSHPD advised staff that there is nothing in the code or USP that prevents a designer from venting the room through the hood, and noted that the key is to ensure that the design would not violate the hood's listing requirement to be able to maintain the ISO 5 environment. Committee discussion. The discussion was advised that the board staff received information that the board's requirements could be placed in the building standards code. The board staff will be working with legal counsel to determine if such a change is necessary, and if so, the best strategy for implementation. Number 7, a proposed change to CCR 1751.4 regarding decontamination requirements and cleaning frequency. In response to questions submitted previously, it was suggested that the board consider detailing contamination requirements, as well as reconsider the frequency of cleaning some of the services and areas. The committee considered proposed language that could be used to update such requirements. The cleaning shall be done using a germicidal agent. The use of a sporicidal agent is required at least monthly. When hazardous drugs are being compounded, decontamination with an inactivating agent shall take place before each cleaning. Any dilution of the germicidal detergent, sporicidal agent, or inactivating agent shall only be done with sterile water. 1. All ISO Class 5 services, work tables, services, carts, counters, and the clean room shall be cleaned at least every 48 hours, and at a minimum must be cleaned each day prior to compounding. After each cleaning, disinfection using a sterile suitable agent shall occur on all ISO 5 services, the work tables, carts, and counters. Walls, ceilings, storage, shelving, tables, stools, and all other items in Class 7 or Class 8 environment, and the segregated sterile compounding areas shall be cleaned at least monthly. Cleaning shall also occur after any unanticipated event that could increase risk of contamination. All cleaning materials, such as wipers, sponge, and mops, shall be non-shedding and dedicated to the use in the clean room or ante area, and segregated sterile compounding areas, and shall not be removed from these areas except for disposal. The action was the committee directed board staff to conduct more research to present at the committee at future meetings. And number 8, committee, the change to CCR 17.7E1 regarding alternative testing methods and in-product testing requirements. Committee has previously considered whether a rapid microbial test method may be appropriate to consider. Such testing, when used and applied appropriately, can provide test results much more quickly than the current testing requirements, which can address some of the concerns about the delays in therapy. The committee considered language that would allow for alternative testing methods, and which is provided below. E1, batch produced sterile drug preparations compounded from one or more non-sterile ingredients, except as provided in paragraph 2, shall be subject to documented in-product testing for sterility and pyrogens, and shall be quarantined until the end of the product testing confirms sterility and acceptable levels of pyrogens. The sterility testing shall be USP 71 compliant unless a validated rapid microbial method test is performed. The pyrogens testing shall be confirmed at acceptable levels of pyrogens for USP Chapter 85 limits. Validation studies, method suitability, for each formulation using RMM testing shall be kept in a readily retrievable form at the licensed location. This requirement of in-product testing confirming sterility and acceptable levels of pyrogens prior to dispensing shall apply regardless of any sterility or pyrogen testing that may have been conducted on any of the ingredient or combinations of ingredients that were previously non-sterile. exempt from Pyrogen testings are topical ophthalmic and inhalation preparations. Also related to this section, the committee has previously considered if the board should expand its current exception for in-product testing of non-sterile to batch preparations. Given that pharmacies need to provide compounded preparations when a drug is in short supply, a limited exception for such instances may be appropriate. The committee considered the below language that could be used to create such an exception. 2, the following non-sterile to sterile batch drug preparations do not require in-product testing for sterility and pyrogen. A, preparation for self-administered ophthalmic drops in a quantity sufficient for administration to a single patient for 30 days or less. B, preparations for self-administration inhalation in a quantity sufficient for administration to a single patient for 5 days. C, preparations as currently in shortage on the FDA website for a single patient on a one-time basis for 21 days or less pursuant to a prescription. The pharmacy shall retain a copy of the documentation of the shortage and the specific medical need as part of the record. Committee action. In response to public comment regarding irrigation solutions, the committee directed staff to research if irrigation solutions require Pyrogen testings and report back to the committee for its finding. Attachment 6 includes a copy of each of the above regulation sections showing full regulation text for each section and a paper entitled Strength and Stability Testings for Compounded Preparations. There's also a PowerPoint presentation provided. Okay, is that the last one here? Status? No, okay. So, those were the committee actions. There were a variety of reports, and there's probably should be.
So my understanding, Ellen, is that the committee's still working on these, and we don't have anything yet that's going to go before the board for action.
Right. Now,
Question?
Yes.
Gets back to E, relating to establishing beyond use dating for non-sterile drugs.
Yes.
Preparations and attachment number 4. In attachment number 4, under F, for water-containing topical, dermal, and mucosal liquid and semi-solid formulations. 30-day or extended date, or an extended established by the pharmacist, research, analysis, and documentation. So, in days gone by, and hopefully they're still around, pharmacies located next to dermatologists and next to pediatricians would often get prescriptions and to be compounded, I'll put quotation marks around compounded, 2 or more creams or ointments for a diaper rash or for a skin tag or a wart from a dermatologist or lotions. Do those fall into this category F? So Stan's Drug is putting together something for this young lady's infant that's got diaper rash, which is a one-time prescription of that particular, so it's filled, not in batches. And what does the pharmacist have to go through in order to accommodate this patient?
Are you talking about the emergency regulation E?
No, I'm talking about F. Well, I'm talking about under attachment number 4, compounding limitations and requirements self-assessment. F.
Okay, so attachment 4 is E. Is it F then? Attachment 5?
Water containing, maybe we're not looking at the same thing, or maybe I'm looking at the wrong thing.
Let me look.
I think that it's part of the language of the emergency regulation.
Well, it is.
If I'm tracking what Stan is saying, so I believe it's attachment 4, but I think Stan is referencing big paragraph F from the regulation language.
Got it, okay.
So, is that,
I1F, I1 capital F, is that what you mean, the 30-day?
I1F?
Yeah, okay.
Water containing.
For water-containing topical dermals?
Right.
Okay.
So your question is if the pediatrician next door gives you this combination of items that has had no research behind it. It's like nystatin and what,
That's what we used to use nystatin hydrocortisone cream.
right, right.
Or in the days long gone by, there was Mycolog, which was nystatin and Kenalog cream.
Right. And so, no, I'm not sure what that would.
Or a dermatologist would, a simple preparation for a lotion or an ointment.
That's not available on the market, right?
But doesn't this basically say, though, that if there is no, you basically use your judgment and you would look at literature, whatever you have, the resources that you have, because it's on here. A pharmacist using his professional judgment may establish an extended date if they research by consulting and applying drug-specific and stability documentation. So I'm sure there's something, an article or some support of their professional judgment that would provide this. Before this emergency reg was in place, they could only give a 2-week supply. So now this allows them to use professional judgment for putting a BUD on a non-sterile product.
Yeah, the base is 30 days, this assumed expiration.
Yeah, 30 days or an extended day based on the pharmacist research, analysis,
Well,
and
so again,
documentation.
let's get back to this diaper cream, diaper rash cream. So we're talking about a diaper rash cream. So the pharmacist must analyze, and it must include the nature of the drug and the degradation mechanism, dosage form and its components. Is that?
So I think maybe what you're thinking about, Stan, is, okay, so you get a prescription for, what was nystatin and
Nystatin
Kenalog.
hydrocortisone cream.
And so both of those are effective.
Right.
And so you're saying, okay, it seems to me I can mix those together. Are you going to be dinged by the inspector for not having proof that they work together?
Right.
That's what we're afraid of, or as Mark says, running scared.
Yeah, my curiosity is beyond the date as well. 30 days or what, 180. 30, anyway, my concern is beyond the date too, 30 days.
And so I would hate to see that, where to draw a line is of appropriate therapy. It seems like in your professional judgment, that's appropriate therapy, and common sense says it's supportable. But I don't know if we've got any proof of that anyplace. So again, what kind of a dilemma is that, and how is it going to be? We need to have regulations in this area, and how are those going to be interpreted? And so I guess we need guidelines on that.
I don't know.
So this is emergency regulation, so this language is already in effect. It took effect in December. Right. So this is emergency regulation. And the language, when the board voted to approve and pursue the emergency regulation and then follow it with another one, is what we were trying to do was take our existing regulations and make them more closely conform to USP 795 and 797. So the language that you have in here is consistent with what USP requires.
I think that's actually
Talking about the practicality of it.
Yeah, he's talking about the enforcement of it, of something that that practitioners do every day and have done for years. And so then all of a sudden it seems like with the focus on this regulation, the practitioner becomes in a more perilous situation where they don't know if they're going to be able to compound without consequence.
Well, before they could only do the 2 weeks. So we had like kids with transplant meds had to go get an oral transplant meds, had to go come back every 2 weeks to get refills because that's all the pharmacist could do.
Oh, but see, Stan's worried about the extension is great, but what Stan's worried about is even if without the extension, is he in peril from not having the appropriate documentation of the combination of the two products, I think.
Well, wouldn't you, I mean, if I'm going to compound something, I'm going to look in the literature, make sure there's some stability information somewhere that I could rely upon, because you're basically then just experimenting.
Basically what?
You're experimenting, because you don't know. There's acid, there's pH issues, there's a number of where one drug could destabilize another product? How would you even know?
Well, but it's like this this kind of, well, it's kind of like magic mouthwash. You know, they threw that together.
Go back to that one.
Yeah. I love that.
You know, I mean, we could talk about every aspect of pharmacy in protecting the public. I think that's critical. However, here you are in front of me many years ago with an infant with real bad diaper rash, and you just came from your pediatrician, and your pediatrician, who for years has been using a combination of an antifungal and an anti-inflammatory, mix it together, Stan, put it in a 2-ounce ointment jar, and apply after every diaper change or whatever the pediatrician says. So now what do I say to Amy while she's holding the screaming child about the cream that her physician wants her to have for this child's diaper rash, the reason she brought the kid to the dermatologist? And it does get back to the magic mouthwash. And it does get back to all of these practical pharmaceuticals where you have somebody standing in front of you who's an oncology patient, who's got this awful problem with the mucosa of their mouth. And you have a product that there's no research on, but it works. And what do you say to this person that cannot swallow, cannot eat, and they just got back from the oncologist, and the oncologist said, this will help you. And the expectation is that you compound it. It's part of being a community pharmacist. Maybe it's not the clinical aspect of pharmacy, but it's the community aspect, and it's a community health care. And it's just bewildering to me that this guy's got, all these years of education, and we put roadblocks in between the patient and the patient's well-being. And I realize that there's two sides of that coin, and the pharmacist. I mean, we could say all we want, but if you just want this guy to stand behind a counter and count pills, 5 at a time until you get to 100 and stop. I mean, we're saying professionally, you can do this professionally, do that. You could practically do minor surgery now, but you can't compound nystatin and hydrocortisone cream.
We agree totally with you, Stan. And actually, there are a lot of cases like this, like retin-A, you can combine with triamcinolone. You could apply separately, but when the dermatologist asked me to mix it together, then you're talking about beyond use state and testing product. That would kind of get in the way.
I just don't know how to justify the 180 days. I think you're giving more than 30 days. Let the committee look at this and see what options are available.
I think this is an excellent. You should get some real clarification on it. I think it will do good for the pharmacies and the pharmacists, and for patients that need these medications, and it'll put the pharmacist out of a jeopardy position.
I think it would be good to have me as the pharmacists that actually do this, to give some input, some public input at the committee level.
Jenny?
I just have a quick logistics question that's related to this. Now, this is part of the emergency reg. We are already in the process now of moving forward to making this a permanent change. So I assume that we should continue to make it permanent, and meanwhile, we'll look at a possible way to adjust it. And just so that I understand, as one of the lay people in the room, you're talking 30 days is too short a period for mixing these two products together?
No. I think what the focus is here is professional judgment, and what we as pharmacists need to base that professional judgment on. It says that we have to document what sources we used. Well, we're putting in there aren't any sources out there because it's always been done. It's kind of like, it's kind of analogous to dental floss, where all of a sudden they realized there hadn't been any research on dental floss, so they can no longer recommend it.
You mean I can quit now?
Yeah, you can quit now. I mean, it's ludicrous. We know that it works, but there's no proof. And so if we go by the regulations, an inspector can say, show me the proof. and you don't have any proof, and there's no literature out there because it's not important enough for anybody to do. And so I want to remove the jeopardy of the pharmacists from compounding, just like from filling, because these combinations are necessary, they're traditional, etc., but there's no proof. So if you say use your professional judgment and provide documentation, you can't provide documentation. And so it's another one of those dilemmas that pharmacists should feel comfortable with so that they can mix them and dispense.
Thank you, that helped. I just, and the normal expiration date on this would be at least 180 days, or would there not even be?
Expiration, it's a separate issue from the expiration.
Okay, well, the context for me to phrase it, though, is within the expiration date, because it's 30 days unless you've got proof. So I'm making the conclusion that 30 days is going to be a far shorter expiration date than you would ever put on that.
Well, 30 days is not realistic.
It's too short.
Yeah, that's another.
Okay,
It's a separate issue, but
Especially for a
it's connected.
topical.
Yeah.
We're talking about a topical,
Right.
but I want to speak to beyond the use states, because we had an interesting thing happen here a few years ago. It was the Tamiflu issue.
Oh, right.
How the state of
Yes.
California, and it speaks to beyond the use states.
Right.
Who sets them? How do they set them?
Manufacturers,
You know,
yes.
talk about
Yeah.
research. Is there research about the beyond the use date, or is it an arbitrary date that somebody in either marketing picks or somewhere down the road? But
I can buy more after that date, you know.
Well, that's what I mean in marketing. And so the Tamiflu issue was, correct me when I'm wrong, the state of California bought a huge amount of Tamiflu and had it in warehouses throughout the state for Californians. And the event that they got the flu, there'd be all this oral Tamiflu around, and they could have access to it, and the flu would go away quicker. So lo and behold, the flu season didn't materialize to what they expected, and the Tamiflu was going out of date. Millions of dollars worth of Tamiflu. So someone with the state, God bless that person, went to the manufacturer and said, here, reanalyze this and tell me if it's really going to expire next Tuesday. Well, it came back, another 3 years is okay. So it may not have been 3 years, but whatever it was, it just goes to show you how arbitrary that is.
Well, and we certainly don't want the pharmacists who are doing this kind of compounding got cited and fined because of this. So we need clarification to the public. Otherwise, there will be another paranoia on the pharmacists, and then we have the denial of access for the patients that you'll be complaining.
Right. So we'll move ahead with making permanent the change, and then recognizing at some point we may
you.
adjust it.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
I'm with the mothers of America, in particular the mothers of California, the new mothers.
So Alan, do you want to do public comment on item G?
On item, what was that, G?
G, H, sorry, H, yes.
All right.
Compliance delays.
Oh, look.
Oh, I thought it was G, though. I'm confused. All the proposed changes is what I'm referring to, G. So all of the item G, do you want to do public comment? Danny?
Aye. So what Stan has just said is something that CPHA has been saying for a while now, and he couldn't have put it more eloquently, so I thank you,
Well,
Stan.
thank you for that, Danny. Come back more often.
That's right. And actually, I was going to ask if we can go back to the emergency reg part, because I don't know if we had an opportunity for public comment. On the issue of making these regulations permanent, I imagine that this is essentially a carbon copy of the emergency regs to be made permanent with no changes. Can we expect, given the DCA presentation yesterday of the timeline for pre-notice review, is there an expectation or a realistic expectation that the regular rulemaking process would be a little bit faster since it's a carbon copy of the exact language?
I wasn't here for the presentation. I saw the timeline they provided. I
Okay.
can tell you that sometimes they exceed the timeline they provided.
Okay.
So all we can do is to continue to ask the department to help expedite a pre-review process in order to get the changes out. In this particular case, because we're trying to keep the emergency reg in place, we can extend that only so many times
Right.
without actually doing the rulemaking.
Right.
So, and arguably by having the emergency reg already approved, you would think it would make it easier to go
That's,
through.
that's essentially what I was asking.
That would be
yes.
the argument I think that they can expect to hear from us. But nonetheless, whether or not they're able to deliver because they have other competing issues or whatever, we don't know. But our intent is to keep this in place so we don't have requirements that do this.
On that, we submitted a letter to DCA leadership on that, and we'd be happy to do that again if that becomes an issue, so.
Thank you
I
very
wanna
much.
put that
We
on the
may
record.
take you up on that.
On the FAQs, another really clarification question, I think this has been asked in previous board hearings before, but I'm not sure. If a pharmacist needs to use the FAQ to ask whether a definition is the right definition, whether to apply appropriately, do they now have to be afraid? Is that a guideline set in stone, or if they believe that they're using that so for example sterility, if they are telling the board inspector that yes they are using it per the FAQ, would they be afraid of interpretation of that FAQ from different inspectors? I don't know if I'm
The
asking.
criteria fits
Okay.
the parameters of the FAQ. The reason they're out there is to provide guidance to the industry of how the board is going to apply and enforce this so that the marketplace works a little more smoothly. So they can rely on that.
Well, it was mentioned before that, different inspectors have different interpretations. That's why I brought that up.
But we have the facts now.
all right.
But keep in mind, when there's a difference of interpretation, and it goes to you, it goes to a board member, unless it reaches someone centrally here at the board, it's not going to get resolved, it's going to continue.
Okay.
So we need to be advised so that if we've got, we spend a lot of time, people are spending a lot of time doing sterile compounding training so that we are consistent. We've got a self-assessment so that everyone understands exactly what we're doing and why. So where we've got an inspector that's making an interpretation outside of that, it's important that we know about it so that we don't do that to the profession because it's not our intent.
Great, thank you. Going down the list on kind of a couple of things that Alan was mentioning. On the compounding kits themselves, so CPHA convened an informal task force of compounding pharmacists to kind of come up with specific changes to the existing regulations, and we had submitted a document at the last committee hearing. We're hopeful that the committee members and staff is looking at that and taking that into account. Just want to reiterate that the exemption of the compounding, the FDA-approved compounding kits, there's still a lot of confusion from board members, from staff, even from some of our compounding pharmacists on whether the kits themselves should be exempt from compounding. Our position at CPHA is that those kits should be held to the same standard as compounding kits, and to make sure that really doesn't change. And at the I heard that there is a desire to have actual compounding pharmacists at the next committee. We have reached out to folks and are gathering some folks, some compounding pharmacists to come and testify to that. So we should have that at the next committee hearing. We did submit a proposal to strike the language regarding the prior authorization from a prescriber to compound. And I understand. Actually, let me back up. One of the things I think is to Stan's point earlier, I think there's a lot of confusion. We understand that the New England case was a very big case. The implications of that is still happening now. There's a giant, outbreak. I believe it was meningitis, and people died. And I believe the CEO of that compounding facility is either in prison or is being sent to prison.
The PIC is.
Oh, the PIC is correct. We certainly take that very seriously, and we certainly support having standards in place for compounders that protect the public. I think the problem that we're facing right now is that it seems to us that the board is treating individual compounders as these giant manufacturers when that in some cases may be true, and certainly we would support the board going after them, but a lot of our compounders are not doing that. And so where these regulations are more appropriate to large manufacturers of compounded product, what we're trying to say is that a lot of these regulations are essentially hurting access to patients, like Stan said, the mother who needs the baby rash cream. And so we're hoping that in the document that we submitted at the last committee meeting helps address some of those issues. And like I said, we look forward to hearing feedback from both staff and the board on that. On the specifically related to the BUDs for sterile compounders, I'll just highlight that in our proposal, we're proposing to mirror the exact same requirements for sterile and non-sterile compounding based on the fact that of our task force that we had in convening this document, there was really no rationale for treating sterile and non-sterile compounds differently in terms of establishing beyond use states. And again, as I mentioned, we are having folks who will come to the next meeting to testify to that. Hopefully that will provide some clarification. The same with the frequency of cleaning rooms, RMM testing, and again, I bring this up on the exempting irrigation solutions from Pyrogen testing. This is something that even you, Madam President, had mentioned at the July board meeting that it made sense, and we're just kind of confused as to why this hasn't been included in some sort of proposed changes.
And Dan, I didn't hear you there. What did you say?
So back at the July meeting, one of the requests that we had made is to exempt irrigation solutions from Pyrogen testing. At that time, Madam President had essentially agreed to that, and that's actually in the minutes. And we're just kind of confused as to why that hasn't been proposed in some sort of change to the regulation. So I just bring that up. And
Is that listed, is that pending, Ann, right now? Yeah, I think they're working on it.
The items that we are researching, I think that it's not as easy a question as it seems.
And then lastly, we also submitted additional requests that weren't included in the original last compounding committee's agenda, which is to add a definition of batch as greater than 25 per USP, and deleting the definition of dosage unit that's currently in there. And again, we'll have folks to testify the reasons to that at this next compounding committee. Just wanted to make the full board aware that was going on. So, if there are any questions?
I think part of the confusion that lies with the emergency regulation, we were relying on a USP standard that talked about the 180 days. I think it was USP 71, is that right? I have the right regulation? 95.
I think it's
Okay, there's
795
one
here.
that actually, I think it referenced just non-sterile. And that's what the board relied on. So it didn't include sterile. So I just want to clarify that.
And that's fine. Like I said, we're working on getting people to clarify our kind of proposal as to why we came to that conclusion and why we submitted that.
And a lot of the changes, the whole sterile compounding arena is it's a shifting environment.
Right.
Particularly with the fact that USP right now is even changing.
Right.
797, and they're postponed 800. So it's a moving arena. So I
Right.
think the board staff is trying to review, and I think that the
And,
fact that you're going
you
to
know-
bring in experts will really help. terms of
Absolutely.
trying to
And
move
we're
this forward.
happy. I mean, if staff needs additional help from our experts,
Yeah.
we're more than happy to help out with that.
We appreciate you doing that.
Thank you.
And while you're helping, this is the FDA's guidance that came out in January.
Yes, I do.
Okay, one of the things you specifically requested runs counter to where the FDA is going with that.
That
So
did come out
recognize-
after our proposal was sent
Okay,
out. So.
yeah, I was gonna say, because there's some inconsistencies between what you just proposed
So
and what the FDA says they're going to do.
between now and the next compounding committee, we are hoping to meet again as this informal task force and discuss that and see if there's any changes that we'd like to make to our
Perfect.
proposal.
Yep.
So thank you, guys.
And you'll submit those?
Yes, so at the next committee hearing, we will submit that well ahead of time so the staff has a chance to analyze and hopefully provide feedback by the meeting.
Thanks, Danny.
And if I could just make one clarification so there's no confusion. The board, when it authorized the regular rulemaking, there were a few other minor sections that were amended. So the changes that are made to the changes in the emergency rulemaking are all reflected verbatim in the proposal, and that's in attachment 4. But there's the compliance rulemaking, the one that's following up, does contain a few, 3 or 4 other proposals that the board asked to be included with it.
Done initially, yeah.
That makes sense?
And that was approved by the board?
Yes.
Those additional
Yes,
changes?
correct.
Okay, yeah. All right, Alan.
All right. And
Oh, wait, we have more public comment. Good afternoon.
Again, I'm Rich Sakai, and I've been a pharmacist for 40-plus years, of which 30 were at least director of pharmacy, and most recently.
Talking to Mike, thank you, I thought it was
Recently
just
at
me.
Valley Children's Hospital. In my current role, I'm a project manager for Sutter Health to implement the USP 800 compliance. And my comments today are primarily with the still compounding, and also in particular the Title 16, Section 1735.1, Part R. And the document you guys have listed that was out there in the front is what
We have a copy of that? Okay.
this really is an important document that the board needs to perhaps take a look at. The crux of it really, in my opinion, is the alignment of the board regulations with USP 797 and 800. And the complexity, when there are disparate definitions of the two bodies that the hospitals are trying to comply with to provide great care, is very difficult. And, you know, the politics of you guys talking with CDPH, you know, I'll let you guys deal with that, but.
Oh, come on.
For the consumer, customer, it creates an extreme amount of havoc. And Sutter Health is spending an inordinate amount of money to comply and reach that 7/1 deadline. And I know it's all been pushed back, but we are still going full speed ahead to comply July 1 because we want to provide the best care, quality care for the patients we serve. And I appreciate the board's input because we're putting some mobile pharmacies in, very unique. I tried that a couple of years ago, and it was a challenge, and it's come back. And appreciate that help to get those going. So really, my job is to try to help the several hospitals comply with the regulations. And another challenge that I have is that, and it may be a matter of resources, and maybe Jenny needs more help, probably does. But I would send questions into the FAQ, I'd talk to people, and it would take months for me to get responses back. It's very frustrating. And as I understand, delay in construction costs organizations between $15,000 and $20,000 a week. Okay? And so as a result, if I can't or my colleagues cannot get answers back in a timely fashion about interpretation of the regulations, it is very difficult. And all of you that have worked in pharmacies, if you don't get an answer, you're delaying services. So as a result, I'd like to perhaps suggest that if there is not already a customer service feedback or some metric that the board has, in other words, if a question comes in, the goal is to return that call in so many days or hours or minutes or whatever. Share that, maybe Jenny could share that results, present it to the board so they know the challenges that she is having in terms of having staffing. Because those delays adversely affect what I'm trying to do with those organizations, costing them thousands and thousands of dollars in delays.
And I, looking at the CHA, I think it's a very good point, because if we're going to be using a definition, we need to use it all, which means assessment of risk needs to be included with the hazardous drug. Because you're right, with oxytocin, you don't want to have, and I think we actually had a pharmacist from a pediatric hospital also testify that if there's an urgent drug they need to make, to have to gown up and go into the room to make it doesn't make sense when there's an urgency going on. So I think the assessment of risk, Alan, on the compounding enforcement committee, we need to look at that along with this definition so that it's clear.
You know, I think the The problem is well stated. I think that we all grasp it, the pharmacists on the committee, and that we're going to take action on it.
Yep.
Absolutely. This is a good document, and it brings up salient points, and there should be no argument on it. I agree.
And there's no action being taken today on that definition. It's still pending. No, there's no action at all. So this assessment of risk and all will be discussed
Okay.
at the next enforcement committee.
For the pharmacists on board, you might just want to take a look at that NIOSH list. It's, it's a multi-page document, and, I just wrote down a couple common drugs that we use every day, which would be considered a hazardous drug. And without the pharmacists using their clinical knowledge, it's going to be crazy. Clonazepam, fluconazole, valproate. Okay, those are used every single day. And so that is a challenge. So anyway, to sum up really, so we can all grab lunch so we don't get hangry, is that perhaps provide additional support to the board so we can get the end user timely information back so we could act on those. And also align the Board of Pharmacy's definitions with these, for sterile compounding with USP 797 and 800. And develop some metrics for the board to have and customer service. So the board understands, what the consumer, the pharmacist on the one end is understanding. And I think all of us who worked in organizations have those metrics so we could assess our performance. Thank you.
And I also think, and this is probably directed to Josh and to our council, to see whether we can actually really review this whole issue of utilizing 797 and 800. I know we've always written our own regs, but is there a way to incorporate some of them, or at least, because I know other states are doing that. In California, I don't think we can, is what I had heard. But if we could review that again.
I mean, I'll say what I've said before. It's never been a question of that we couldn't. It's that 797 doesn't have the force of law, that referring to an exterior document, essentially delegates the power of policy to an exterior private organization. And my advice was, and because you typically have to have a subscription in order to even view that document, so my advice was that the board should have its own regulations, but that it can also obviously be informed and should be informed by expert publications such as 797, but that in my view it was not the best policy or practice to do what other states are doing, which is some other states have done, which is just to sort of say, look at 797, which to me I don't think is fully discharging the board's obligation and what the board was trying to do, which was to create its own understanding of what safe compounding practices should be.
I would argue that the 797 and 800 is really federal, and we are mandated really to, when CDPH pharmacists come out, that's what they hold us to. And so.
Right, there's a difference though for the purposes of what JCO or even CDPH inspects according to.
When they
and
come
what
in
is
with
and
a
what is
federal
the
hat
legal
on, as they call
responsibility
it.
of pharmacies. So they may inspect according to 797, but that's not the same thing as saying it has the force of law in California.
So we can look at it.
Yeah, I just say, let's have that discussion, because maybe for USP 800, we could do that. Because that's more focused at employee protection rather than patient safety.
And especially in the next couple of years when this comes out.
Yeah, it's going to be a new revised, we're going to be constantly revising regulations and falling behind what the federal regs are. So good points.
Thank you.
And before you leave, I have one quick comment on having us part of the review process for your architectural plans. We're not positioned in a position to be able to review those plans. We're not architects. It's difficult for us. That's part of the role of OSHPD. That's why they're there, and they're part of the review process. And that's why the three agencies are trying to work together cooperatively. But when you send in a request, there are things asking for law interpretations, which are one thing. When you start asking us, can I design it this way? Can I do it this way? And especially when it comes in highly technical, our staff is going to be ill-positioned to be able to respond to those. The FAQs are very carefully vetted through legal, which takes part of the time too. So I just want you to know, we can't be with you in all of your steps through the process.
Right, I'm primarily talking about the licensure and application of how for example, the interpretation of full regulation 4029 with, an infusion pharmacy that's good licensed underneath the hospital. I'm still waiting to get the final rule on that. I still have a
Well,
couple.
resend whatever it is to me and send it directly to me, and then I'll see what I can do about getting you an answer more timely.
Thank you.
Okay?
Okay,
Thank you. Any more public comment? And then we'll go on to item H.
Good, that's enough public comment.
No, you have one more.
One more. Here we go. Here we go.
I'm Morgan with Cutis Pharma. Nice to meet everyone. I have a question going back to compounding
Oh,
kits.
explain who, everyone doesn't know who you are, who Cutis is. A lot of the board members do, but
I don't.
I know.
So with Cutis Pharma, we manufacture the first compounding kits. And Amy, I had met you at CSHP. Nice to see you again. Yeah, and Alan. My question for clarification here is going back, Stan, what you were saying. So you have that patient, oncology patient, needs magic mouthwash, right? The pharmacist is put into a situation where, I can make it myself, but there's no stability, correct? So that's kind of that error of judgment. You use your professional judgment. Well, why not? There already is a kit for magic mouthwash with stability data. So why, for those certain prescriptions that have a kit with stability data that are FDA regulated, why couldn't that kit be more of a standard?
One of the big challenges you have, and I think we've had this discussion, is that you don't have an NDC number. So it's not FDA approved.
Okay.
So from a claims perspective, it's really hard for pharmacies to submit claims, especially if they're Medicare Part D, if they don't have an NDC number. So go seek that FDA approval. Get
Well,
yourself
actually,
an
we
NDC
just got
number.
one approval. Yeah, as of
What I was,
Friday.
I was referring to that, not knowing that there's a kit.
Right.
And it was just an example.
Oh, totally.
That, as a community pharmacist, you have someone standing in front of you who has a need for a particular preparation.
Right.
That would fall into the regs that we were talking about. Now, the patient knows it works, the physician knows it works,
Yep.
and neither of them have any of the data that
Support it.
So, I mean, the fact that sure, if there's a kit, we can use it, or a pharmacist can use it, great. And, and when we were compounding, we didn't have NDC numbers on that stuff, and couldn't, maybe you needed that for insurance billing, but especially with like the magic mouthwash, these people, I don't think insurance was an issue. They were there to get some kind of comfort, and I mean, I don't think insurance was a big issue. I think they would have been more than happy to purchase it, regardless of what the insurance status was with that particular product, just to get relief.
Oh, right. So she's, a matter of fact, this has offered a solution to a variety of the
It's a
comments.
great
Yeah,
solution.
well, that's great.
And so we'll probably be hearing more in the future. Fill the marketing niche perfectly. And your example was just a segue for.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
so,
And we had nothing to do with this beforehand, did we?
That's not what I'm hearing.
Oh, you mean with
that was a little joke.
the kids?
That
Okay,
was
yeah.
a
yeah.
Stan
It was a joke all the way.
Thank you.
I'll interpret those as time goes on.
Alan, H.
Okay, H, here we are. A status report on the waivers issued for compounding construction compliance delays pursuant to California Code of Regulations, Title 16, Section 1735.6 and 1751.4. Relevant law. Title 16 of California Code of Regulations states that where compliance with the California compounding regulation requires physical construction or alteration to a facility or physical environment, the board may grant a waiver for a time period to permit the required changes. There is a related provision, CCR 1751.4, which provides the same allowances for sterile compounding facilities. An application for a waiver must be made in writing, identify the provisions requiring physical construction or alteration, and provide a timeline for those changes. The board is able to grant a waiver for a specified time period when in its discretion good cause is demonstrated for the waiver. The initial waiver is performed by staff and led by the executive officer who approves or denies the waiver request. Approval or denial of the waiver is provided to the facilities in writing. If a waiver is denied by the executive officer, there is an appeal process made by the two board members currently shad in law. The goal of the construction waiver process is to secure full compliance at the earliest possible time. Facilities that have been denied the waiver have been made aware there is an appeal process. Such waiver goes to the super subcommittee of Shadden Law. There have been no appeals since July 1, 2017. The committee noted that the waiver review process is ongoing as pharmacies continue to seek modification in the facilities to comply with USP 800. During the 2017 November board meeting, the delay in 800 to December 2019 was discussed, by which time the board granted authority to the executive officer to grant waivers through November 30, 2019. The board's continued monitoring of the progress is consistent with USP, which is, quote, encouraging early adoption and implementation of Chapter 800 to ensure safe environment and protection for healthcare practitioners and others when handling hazardous drugs. The committee was advised that since the waiver process began, 415 waivers have been approved, and the board continues to receive a relatively low number of new requests. However, as implementation of waivers transitions to a monitoring phase, the board staff is now undertaking a review of status reports that are documenting progress of an entity to achieving compliance. Enforcement statistics. Enforcement statistics for the 6 months of financial year 17-18 are provided in Attachment 7. The board received 13,006 complaints and has closed 1,454 investigations. The board has issued 103 letters of admonishment, 1,035 citations, and referred 185 cases to the Office of the Attorney General. The board has secured 3 interim suspension orders and has been granted 6 Penal Code 23 suspensions and issued 1 cease and desist. Further, the board has revoked 54 licenses, accepted disciplinary surrender of 28 licenses, and imposed other levels of discipline against the 75 licensees. The future committee meeting dates are March 28th, June 7th, September 5, and December 13th. Committee report, though, as chair of the committee, I would like to get in the minutes something that I would like to see addressed in the enforcement committee. I'd like to mention that at this time, if that's okay. Okay, so yesterday we were looking at revenues and transfers, and revenues in 4129200, which is essentially fines. We had $2.5 million, which is kind of nice on one hand, but it's kind of intimidating to the companies and the pharmacists that are affected by these. Throughout the meeting today, we've had terms such as CPHA says, does the pharmacist have to be afraid? Then there was a mention, someone talked about paranoia. Mark talked about running scared. Transparency has been mentioned. And so lately it's come to my attention, and all of our attention actually, that there's a disparity between the pharmacists that appear before the board and pharmacists that approach the board members, us, with concerns. And the reason that so few come before the board is they have a fear of retribution. We've all heard this, the pharmacists that communicate with fellow professionals. And we, the board, are a strong regulatory board with deep pockets and strong legal support. And this is intimidating to those without the time and resources to bring their cases forward. In reviewing in several of the cases, I'm concerned that our committee is becoming too focused on punishment. You know, some of these fines that we put on these people are 4 years, 5 years after the offense has been committed. I mean, this is not a quick fix for public safety. It's too bureaucratic punishment, and so I think that we're being too focused on punishment without commensurate or equivalent increase in our mandate of public protection. And so I think we should really look into this. Maybe a combination of the enforcement committee or the legislation committee. I'm not sure, but I do want to get it on the agenda of the enforcement.
So could we maybe, Alan, do a drill down on what some of these fines, what that $2 million composed of?
Oh, yeah.
And have the enforcement committee kind of report back to the board?
Oh, I think that's a good idea. I'll talk to Ann about that prior to the meeting.
And we'll put it on the enforcement agenda. Okay, I think you have I, the enforcement statistics, which basically is an attachment, right?
Right.
Attachment 7 is on there, and then the future committee dates are in the packet.
Right.
Okay.
I have one quick update, if I may, on the waivers.
Before you, go ahead, because I was going to do public comment, but go ahead on the if it's on the waivers.
Okay.
But you're going to something else.
We have extended 143 waivers to November 30th, 2019. Those are submitted. We asked, we received them, and we requested input. We have 271 that we heard nothing from, where we assume that they're either fully compliant now and they've implemented and no longer need to extend the waivers or do anything of that nature because they didn't respond.
I would think that they'd respond.
You would think if they wanted an extension. So during the course of, if they're sterile compounders, we'll see them over the course of the next year. If they're regular compounders, we may not. So we're moving ahead believing that they have an obligation to keep their waivers current. And we have reached out in order to get what we did get. And we're hoping that a lot of these are compliant. They've been able to complete according to when they thought that they would be in compliance, which is a good thing. Because we had initially used a date of January 1, 2018 as the compliance deadline. So we believe that the lack of response has been good.
So if I understand that, then we also have approved all the waivers, so Alan and Victor have not had to meet
We don't
to
have
review any?
We haven't denied any.
Okay, they've all been approved. Good. Any public comment on any of the enforcement items?
One more question on the waivers. Those that I'm helping with several hospital pharmacies, their waivers expire for whatever reason on July 1st, 2018. Will there be expected to reapply for an extension of the extension?
We want them to reapply if they're not going to be done by July. But as you said, we really encourage you to continue to move forward to be compliant at the earliest possible time.
Okay. And
So if you don't need it, you don't need to extend it. If it looks like you're going to go past July 1, you need to extend it.
Okay, I was wondering if the board would just send out an FYI letter saying those of you expiring on July 1st, if you need more time, please apply. If not, move on.
Please
But
move
I'll
forward.
have them-
Otherwise, because there's only so much
Yeah.
talent out there available
Okay.
to get you into that venting.
I'll have them reapply.
Process.
The other question is are 100% of the existing waivers extensions been processed?
We don't have any pending according to the mailbox that we use. So if you haven't heard, I think you need to follow up again because everything was done that was received.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comment? Okay, otherwise we'll move on to the executive officer report.
Okay, let me find my executive officer report. Okay. So we've already heard a report today. I won't go into great length about it, but we did a joint Board of Pharmacy, Prescription Drug Abuse, and DEA webinar or Prescription Drug Abuse CE session on the 27th of January, and we had 220 people attend, and we have now trained 700 pharmacists to provide naloxone. So, a copy of the agenda is in the packet. We intend to do another one, we believe, in downtown Los Angeles on or about April 29th. Regarding cures, any questions? Update on cures. Yesterday, the reason I was late to the board meeting was that I had been given the opportunity to speak a little bit to the Assembly Committee on business and professions on Cures 2.0. I talked a little bit about how we are educating pharmacists to use Cures 2.0, the corresponding responsibility of a pharmacist. We use the results that we obtained from Dr. Henry's survey of pharmacists on their attitudes that was provided as part of one of the prior meeting materials today. And I had a few questions from various members, but I believe the presentation went well. So that's part of our outreach. I think a couple of stats that I think the board ought to keep in mind that we had for the month of December, we had 22.9% of those who are registered to access the Cures system are pharmacists. And of those, they have generated over nearly 60% of the reports out of the system. So it shows that pharmacists are aware of Cures and they're using it. And in fact, the survey results, pharmacists state that it changed their practice more than anything else with respect to how they handle prescription medications. I gave a couple of examples of horror stories of situations that had either a prescriber or a dispenser check. They wouldn't have dispensed the medication to the patient in front of them. So,
Do you anticipate legislation requiring the use of Cures? Because right now it's not required, right?
well, technically for a prescriber it is.
For prescriber, but not for the pharmacist.
The dispensers are actually using it without a mandate, not in all cases, but they are using it, and they're using it at a far higher rate than the prescribers are.
So maybe legislation isn't needed to
That's right.
get them to use it?
Well, maybe. I'm not sure that there won't be a bill introduced. There's a lot of people looking for bills to author this year. It's the year of the opioid, I think we could say, in the California legislature.
Well, it's not something that we would necessarily want to originate.
I don't know. I think the board doesn't, I think initially there was a bill in the bill that required dispensers to do it, also required pharmacists to do it. I don't believe that the board opposed that. But the dispensers were removed from the bill before it was enacted.
Thank you.
Any questions? Just one of the fun things I've been able to do lately, I was appointed to an NEVP task force on their model guidelines or their model regulatory programs. I've been sworn to secrecy. I can't tell you what I was doing, but I did represent California's interests in that area. So it was the first time California's been part of that group, so I don't know whether or not it'll be an ongoing thing, but they do this annually. Any other questions on that? A couple of weeks ago, I went to the Federation of Association of Regulatory Boards meetings. This is an association of regulatory boards, as it sounds. And the reason I went, it was in San Diego, and it's difficult to go out of state for travel. And this was because it was local. I figured there'd be a lot of DCA boards present. There were none. I was the only representative from California at this meeting. I will tell you that compared to other states, the Department of Consumer Affairs in general, and this board specifically, are well advanced compared to most other regulatory boards with what they do. I spent 2 hours sitting on a mock panel where they were doing trial board meetings as a means to educate the 400 people or so that were there. And one of the things is that there was a motion and a second, and they moved straight to the vote without asking for public participation. And I just put the brakes on. I said, whoa, wait a minute, we can't vote yet. Not a single other board present requires public comment before the board votes on a decision. Pretty amazing. That one really surprised me. Yeah.
That seems like that's procedural.
It is in California. It is not outside California.
Oh, wow.
Surprise. They do give public comment part of the agenda, but they don't have it before a board vote, which is instrumental. So anyway, it's fully incorporated in our way of doing business. They spent a lot of time talking about the North Carolina decision, which we've been talking about for a number of years. The odd takeaway, or maybe a good takeaway, was one of the people who was responsible for the FTC's position on that was actually at the meeting. And so she articulated that they're not through with this particular process yet, that they're continuing to look in this area for other examples of where a board has quit acting as a public protection entity and more as a guild to protect its members. So, and that was pretty much the language she used. So, any questions on that? I don't think that there's a need for us to attend this in the future, however. There are some new FDA guidance documents, and I pointed out to Mr. Martinez that they need to look at one of them. One of the things, and I put comments that I literally excerpted out of the policy statement for where the FDA is going with respect to compounding in the future, but there are some very specific things that they're looking to do. They recognize the need for compounding to occur. They, however, want pharmacies to do only patient-specific compounding, and if there's a commercially available product, they are not to compound it unless there's a shortage or unless there's a specific reason why there's an additive that's being added to that product that's specific for that patient, and there's a note to that effect. That's one of the issues. They are, during the next year, the FDA intends to address quality standards for outsourcing facilities. I will tell you, as we're stepping into outsourcing facilities, that's much needed. Regulate compounding from bulk drug substances. Restrict compoundings of drugs that are FDA copies of drug approval, and they were very clear that if there's an approved drug out there, pharmacies should not be, nor outsourcers should be compounding this unless there's a shortage. Solidify the FDA's partnerships with state regulatory authorities. I don't know what more solidification we need to do here in California. We work pretty closely with the FDA, and we're grateful for that partnership. And provide greater guidance on other activities that compounders undertake. The other thing that I wish to put forward is that they are looking to establish the memorandum of understanding with states that they talked about before. I don't know if anyone remembers, but at that point it was if you are going to ship across state lines as a pharmacy, anything more than 5%, the state would have to have a MOU on file with the FDA to enforce specific provisions, and then they could ship up to 30%. They have revised the guidelines and where they state that they are going. The MOU is not yet available, but now they're looking at 50% as the threshold, and they've backed off a little bit on the amount of audit the Board of Pharmacies would have to do in order to determine what that 50% is. So there are some additional guidance documents that they released in early January. We are bringing those to the Enforcement Committee, which is beginning to sound like a 2 or 3 day meeting from the sound of it already. But anyway, so any questions about the FDA and its guidance documents? We continue to work very closely with them, however. Okay. There are additional statistics related to the CPJE exam that were unfortunately omitted in the prior report that was provided to you in November. The corrected report is provided to you. The overall pass rate on the CPJE during this period was 78%. Pardon me?
You had a crash.
Yeah, my guess is it would be in attachment 3.
Is it a chart you're referring to? Yeah, page 5.
It's on page 5.
Yeah.
Oh, it's actually on the charts. Okay, yes.
So, not to 2 years make a trend, but is there a trend or the beginning of a trend, or are we finding that either the exam is more difficult or that the quality of the applicants is less than what it has been, or is there something we can read into these couple of years which are curious?
Psychometrically, our exam is not more difficult. That's part of why we hire a firm to defend the exam and make sure that the pass score is set appropriately. So that is calibrated. But there's a general feeling that because there are more schools of pharmacy, the selectivity of who's getting into the schools of pharmacy has changed. And it's affecting not only the recruitment, and some of the schools are having a hard time even filling all of their seats right now. Whereas before there was a decline in, or there were people that would be denied admission. But now we're at, 13 schools, and we have 2 more in the wings ready to come up. So we're going to have 15 schools of pharmacy very soon in California.
It also looks, if you look at the NAPLEX too, Stan, it looks like it's gone down a little bit too with this. So if you look at the numbers, there's a corresponding, because it was up like 98, 95 at the beginning. It went down to 90, 91.
They were in the process, they also changed their exam, and then if you remember, we changed our exam. The board specifically wanted more law questions, and we believed the students were not prepared for the law questions.
The questions aren't straight law questions, they're application of the law questions. And so that requires a true knowledge base. And so so they have taken that into consideration. It was discussed and by the committee, and it was really given consideration.
At a competency committee.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, one of the things that President Gutierrez requested is that all pharmacist board members spend at least one competency committee meeting sitting in and participating in the examination development. And I believe only 2 of you have indicated that you're interested. So expect a Dunning letter from.
I think we were all scheduled, because I know I've got one coming up. And I think the reason that that I actually asked that is when we're required to oversee the exam. So I figure if we're not part of this, how can we really oversee it? So at least spending 1 day a year, I think is appropriate for each of
Your
us.
best day ever.
Yeah, and you actually have been more than any of us, Alan. Do you think it's a valuable experience for a board member to see this?
The answer is yes, I can hear it. I can hear it already.
I am torn. The company is very good. You know,
Spend 1 day to see how it's done.
We're running out of time.
In all actuality, it shows you how the questions are vetted, how they're voted on. To get a full feeling of it, you should be there for the full 2 days. It's very educational. There are many. It's just long. That's the downside.
Victor, you've gone too, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Victor's done it. Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting to see the knowledge base that's required, how the questions are vetted, how they are compared to other questions, how there is a decrease in the ability for the students to cheat. There's a number of things that are made apparent by attending the meeting that you really can't explain, and the committee members are dedicated to making it better. There's a few of them that are very, very dedicated.
They're amazing people.
Do you believe the value is the same for a public member?
What's that?
Do you believe the value is the same for a public member versus a licensed?
We'll be happy to put you in there with the specific request.
What do you think of his question? Do you think that, Victor and Alan, do you think a public member should participate at least to see it?
I
think so.
I would like everybody to share the misery, but I don't.
The camaraderie.
I really don't think that a public member would gain as much as a licensed member would. I think it'd be too much of a waste of time. I think a licensed member can get a real feel for the nature of the questions, and I think the knowledge base is too different for the public members.
But they could feel the torture for those 2 days.
Well, the process. I was really impressed. You know that Greg actually signed up for sterile compounding training. He actually, yeah, I mean, to actually have gone, you watched some of the videos as well and everything.
Okay.
Well, actually, I think there are a few classes of new school students will be taking the exam this coming June. So you'll see the real picture of the new classes. That's what Stan was asking about. Because the last statistic only showed the 8 schools that were well established. Now that you have the new class, I think Chapman, KGI, they are coming
North
up.
State?
Yeah, North State are coming up to take the board this June, and we'll find out at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. North State's new, but they've been reporting the stats. Okay, I have two more items. The first is we have completed another round of undercover operations on failure to consult. This time it was against Target, where the 3 DAs have used the unfair business practice statute, has gone in and observed repeated instances where patients were either screened or not provided consultation when required. And this one, in part because Target is no longer operating their pharmacies, it took the AG's office a couple of years to get this out too, settled for $131,000. It joins CVS, Walgreens, and Walmart, each of whom paid in the vicinity of $500,000 each for failure to consult violations in California. And we received $5,000 because of our expertise that we provided in terms of framing the investigation. So this will be written up in our newsletter and go out as another effort of the board to help ensure that patients receive the consultation they're required to receive. And then a copy of the settlement agreement is provided in an attachment for us so you can see what they agreed to. And then finally, I want to just highlight that we are in the throes, well, actually, I guess I've got two items here. We are continuing to provide high-level training for inspectors. So when we hear inconsistencies, it's a big deal to us because we spend a lot of time doing this. There are telephone webinars that they do twice a month with all inspectors who do inspections for sterile compounding, and we are now bringing out the experts to provide 40 hours or a 3-day training on sterile compounding. In order to take that class, they have to review and take the 40 hours of classroom training that's required as a prerequisite to take the training. The training is being provided in California. They are also finishing for a few inspectors that were unable to complete the aseptic hands-on training at Toro. We are finishing that training with our inspectors as well. So we continue to aggressively train our inspectors.
Any board member questions, comments? Public comment? Okay, we'll move on to the Organizational Development Committee. Make this, I think it's pretty straightforward. The budget update report, the new fiscal year started July 1st. The board's authorized expenditures are $22,317,000, and I think you're going to be working with the budget office to reconcile that against the report that we received yesterday.
That work started yesterday.
Perfect, okay. And then the rest of this is about the fiscal system, which we heard about yesterday at the meeting. Any board member comments regarding this? Public comment? Item B is board member reimbursement and attendance information that is referenced in the attachment. Their board members are not required to receive reimbursements for attendance hours, only upon the submission of request for those payments, per diem payments. Attachment 1 has the board member attendance as well. Any board member comments? Public comment? A future board meeting dates is listed. We have a petitioner meeting on March 27th, and then our next full board meeting is May 2nd to 3rd, 2018, and the rest of the dates are on the attachment for the org development.
Amy, we don't have the return of the ballot statistic on the board members.
Yeah, we actually were, we haven't had that for a while, because as long as we get a quorum to submit it, we were fine without having to collect that information. It just, as long as we have, all we need is a quorum. The last couple of times that we've had issues, we have had issues with quorum, so we may want to revisit that again. Because I know we had to bring a couple of cases here, because we didn't have, what do you guys think? Do we want to start collecting that again? I mean, it's just, they're going to have to collect it.
It's busy work. I
It's
mean,
busy
I think
work.
if we don't have a need, I don't think we.
We've been able to really accomplish things without having to get that data.
Let's not punish the
Yeah,
staff.
they're really trying to do the best with the enforcement cases. Okay, any other board member comments? Public comment? Yes.
Clarifying, following up on yesterday's comments from the Reg Committee, petitioner board meetings, are you, is there a view that legislative items can't come up during these meetings?
I think we asked staff we'll post an agenda.
Okay.
But if there are any pending ledge reg issues that we need to take a position, I think we asked staff to include that as part of the petitioner meeting.
Yeah, okay, I'm just making sure that
Yeah.
that was part of that. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. All right, meeting adjourned.
Yay.